Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 RHA Economic Summit. My name is Candace Chevalier. I work with Lee and Associates, and I've been in the apartment industry for almost 20 years now, hard to believe. And I work on the multifamily team. I will be your MC today, and looking forward to a great event. And we can go ahead and get started when everyone's ready. Today we've got a great lineup, a general economic trend overview with James McCaffrey, followed by a deep dive into single family investment trends by Jamie Nacht, and then multifamily investment trends by Dylan Simon. We'll take a break and then dive into tax law trends with Austin Bolin, and then rental housing and legislative trends with Chester Baldwin. And then we'll have kind of an open panel discussion, quick Q&A at the end that I think will be really interesting to hear that dynamic discussion. And so a couple of housekeeping items. We will plan to use the Q&A if you have questions through the presentations that are specific to that topic. Feel free to put those questions in a Q&A. I'll be monitoring it as well as the speakers, and we'll bring those up during those individual sessions. If you're having tech support issues, feel free to use the chat for that, but any questions, please direct towards the Q&A. And our first speaker is James McCaffrey, and I'll let you take it away, James.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Good morning. Everyone loves economics first thing in the morning, Candace. I'm always excited to be first up and get in there. At least there's no math today. So no, everyone can put their slide rules down, and we're just gonna have a good time here. So we're gonna talk about the curious economy. And it's kind of a fun title. We play with our titles a lot in our talk. So we have a lot of things going on in the economy to kind of talk through, and because we didn't sign up for a 10-hour tour today, it's going to be pretty high level, but I'm hoping you guys jump in with questions and comments along the way, and I'll watch that, and Candace is watching, so we'll definitely take side projects if we get to it. So where do we start from? Well, first of all, it's just overwhelming, right? I mean, let's just be honest. We're being drowned in data and information constantly, and I don't blame people for being confused or having some very interesting ideas around what's going on in the economy, because honestly, I have an entire research team and we struggle to keep up. There's a lot going on. And so my running joke right now is the tale of two Homers, perhaps. And so we have the Odyssey of Homer versus the Doe of Homer. And it's we're in one of those two spaces, depending on kind of what your own personal thoughts are and kind of your experiences with what's going on. So know that we're in the Homer continuum, if we shall, for today. So today we're going to talk about broad economic indicators. We're going to roll into some regional implications, and then I'm hoping you guys ask questions, because otherwise I just talk to myself, and that's why I got out of doing radio. So let's talk about fundamentals. There's nothing wrong with the economy. And that's the thing I always want to start with. There's nothing wrong per se with the economy. There's always outliers. There's always things that could be better. There's always things that are perhaps moving in the wrong direction. That's fine. It's just like anything else. It's never perfect, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong. It's not like the 70s, the 80s, the 2008. Those all had structural issues with the economy. There were things that were actually wrong. Here we have mostly temporary type issues, or transitory is the fancy word that we would use. But really, there's not structural issues for us to really say we've got issues with. So let's talk about you and the economy. So the challenge is for you to start engaging with complexity as just a normal, ordinary person, and that's a tall order to ask, because I know most people, if you struggled your way through Econ 101 or 102 or micro, macro, whatever you called it, even at a high school level challenge through the economics modules, there's a lot there, and trying to figure out what's going on and how does this interrelate. And I always try and help people think about the economy in terms of just think about how you behave, because the economy really is just people interacting and doing things that they normally are doing in their normal day. And yeah, we can track it down to money and movement of things. But at the end of the day, we're talking about how you behave, and you being every single other person on the planet at the same time. So that's why it gets complex, I think, very quickly for folks, is because we're not used to thinking about it from that perspective. So really struggle to understand an issue rather than just looking at a basic chart or listening to one person or a source. Really try and struggle through and understand the complexity of the issue and what's going on to get a better idea of what may actually happen coming out of it. And again, you got to think about how humans will behave. And then find strategies for your business that align with data trends and forecasts. And today I'm going to highlight key takeaways for you here in this orangey yellow, whatever color that is. We'll call it orange. We're going to highlight that for you as we go through, just so they kind of jump out at you as we talk. So we're going to start with broad economic indicators, and maybe hot topics would be more appropriate, although there's a store by that name, so I try and stay away from it. But what is going on in these broad economic indicators that really has people's attention? Well, supply chain, inflation, workforce participation or unemployment numbers, and you saw some of that data perhaps out this morning if you've been up early reading news. Fed policy issues are things that have a lot of attention. And again, I'm going to poke all of you in the audience a little bit. I'm hoping to see some stuff in the chat here as we or the Q&A as we move forward. So supply chain. Now, few people really appreciated supply chain before COVID. I don't think a lot of people even knew what the supply chain was. And then I left you a picture here of toilet paper because, wow. Toilet paper is a fixed commodity. There's a direct correlation to people count and the amount of square footage of toilet paper that has to be produced in any given year. It's a very fixed correlation. It's a supply chain that doesn't have a lot of variation in it. There's no seasonality in it. It's a very boring commodity. And yet here we were faced with these like massive shortages of toilet paper. And the toilet paper industry is like, we don't want to create more because you can't use any more than yeah. So in economics, we call that a distribution problem. If I need toilet paper and it's all at Candace's house, it doesn't help me, right? So it's a distribution problem at that point, not a supply problem. So I want to show you some data here from the Port of Los Angeles. So the United States has a lot of ports, right? Washington State has the most ports of any state, which is a fun side trip. But if we looked at the volume of the port of Los Angeles, and LA is a good port to kind of play with. And if you have an iPhone, your iPhone has gone through the port of LA because all the iPhones in the United States has gone through Los Angeles. But we look at how many containers has gone through the port of LA. In 2021, it was 10.6 million. And if you can get your head around 10.6 million containers, you've done better than I do. That's a really big number. But if we go back in time, it's actually 1.5 million higher than historical. So even in the height of, oh, we have all these supply chain problems, the ports were moving as much or more stuff in and out of the United States. It wasn't a throughput problem. Now, the media talked about it as a throughput problem, right? We talked about expanding ports to 24/7 operations. We talked about doing all these kinds of things. The problem is you all were buying too much stuff. American consumers throughout COVID have spent a ton of money. And because of that, it's caused supply chain problems. It's also caused inflation that we'll talk about in a moment. If you look at this chart here below, this is personal consumption expenditures. So you can see this is and don't get lost in the numbers here. Just look at the pretty blue line. What you've got is billions of dollars over time. And you can see here since 2000 that we've gone from roughly, let's just call it $6 billion to now we're up almost over $16 billion in spending. American spending is way up. And yeah, you see that nice big drop, that nice V shape there. That was you freaking out 2 years ago. Oh my gosh, oh, the world's ending. And everyone stopped buying stuff. Fine. And then it has roared back. And so I always say it's kind of that the neat thing about doing these on Zoom is you can get your pencil out, which you can't see because there you go. And you can hold it up to your screen and you can look and say, we're actually a little bit above trend. We're actually spending more than we would have normally without COVID. Huh. That's an interesting trend to kind of keep in mind. Keep your pencil out. There's more trend lines for you to follow along at home. All right, so that brings us to supply chain. So the biggest challenge with supply chain are far more complex than the package of toilet paper that I was talking about. Containers actually move a lot more raw materials than finished goods. There's a lot of really, okay, so a few months ago, there was the containers that were burning and et cetera up in the San Juan Islands. And they got, and the stuff got into the water, and oh my gosh, and what were in those containers, it was all raw materials. It wasn't finished goods. It was all raw materials. Well, I ordered a new stove 15 months ago. I got it 2 weeks ago. The problem was they didn't have all the parts to make the stove, right? So that's part of the problem in the supply chain, is that we got to get the raw materials to the right places so they can make the goods and then get those goods to you. So it's a long sequence of relationships that happens. And if we're missing one item, then it means no product. So China has suffered significant power grid problems, which most people in the US are not really aware of. Multiple reasons, but they've shut down factories for certain periods of the time of the day or certain periods of the week. They have greatly diminished their own capacity because they have had power grid problems as a country, and they continue to. It's partially resolved, but they're still struggling with power issues. It's actually very interesting to dig into, and if you're bored later today, look that up, because it's kind of an interesting discussion that hasn't really been talked about here. But then you also have all the COVID containment problems that China's had, and the United States right now, we're I'm reading lots of stuff today. People are very excited because mask mandates are falling, and et cetera, et cetera. But then you look internationally, and we've got all kinds of problems internationally. That's going to continue to affect our supply chain because, again, raw materials, subcomponents, all these things are produced all over the world. And so as different people struggle with these different localized challenges, it's going to impact us for years to come. The other interesting challenges, and you probably read articles this year about how Home Depot had chartered their own cargo vessels, and all these different things had happened where people were using private vessels to move inventory so they could have things in their store. And that worked. I mean, we didn't see the kinds of losses in inventory and ability to buy things over the holidays as were expected, in part because of that. But it also complicated port transfers because those smaller vessels hold less stuff and they take longer to unload. And so they actually diminished port capacity by doing that, which shows up in other places. And then companies like Mattel said, we're just going to put Barbie on an airplane. Normally she'd come by boat, cruise ship, I guess, for Barbie. But we're going to put her on an airplane and we're going to fly her here, which greatly increases the cost of landing those goods into the stores. And so we've seen a lot of increases in use of aircraft transportation as well to do that. So the takeaway here is expect to see a lot of changes in supply chain and inventories in the coming couple of years. They're all going to likely increase the cost of goods. We're seeing companies increase the amount of inventory they want to keep on hand, both in finished goods and in raw materials, because they're hedging against interruptions. We're seeing all kinds of tweaks, people wanting to produce things internally. One of the key points for supply chain is globalization is actually deflationary. By having things produced around the world where it's less costly to produce them, it brings down your final cost at the store. And so globalization actually gets you lower costs at the end of the day, which is an interesting conversation right now I think we're all having as a people. So the question that you also have to pose around this are these changes, are they long-term or are they more short-term? That sticky or transitory are the fancy words here. So some of these changes are going to be long-term, and they're going to permanently increase the cost of goods. But on the other hand, some are going to be short-term, and so that affects you as a business owner, right? It also affects the people that are living in your units, because it's going to affect their ability to pay rent and afford to do other things within their lives. So that brings us to just talking about inflation in general. And inflation is often cast as this terrible thing. Inflation's bad. Inflation's actually not bad. It's good and bad. It does good things. It also does some hard things. The challenge we've had is we haven't had significant inflation for a long time. And when I say a long time, and you can check out this chart down here, the last time we saw real inflation was in the late 70s, early 80s. We haven't seen inflation since then. Ironically, we also haven't seen real wage growth for a large number of people in our communities since that same time frame, because inflation brings higher earnings, as you have seen in the media. And when you have low inflation for a very long time, you erode earnings, which again is a challenge for you, right? If you're thinking about renters, who rents traditionally, it's lower income folks. It's people with higher incomes tend to purchase homes. And so not all, right? But in general. And so this is going to be an interesting piece to really watch to see what happens with inflation. And again, I'll remind you that globalization is deflationary. So next time someone tells you globalization is terrible, say, well, it's neither good or bad. It has positives and negatives like everything else. So you often will read about CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, and I have a running battle with, I think CPI can be horribly misleading. It sounds so absolute. It sounds so like, oh, CPI is going up, inflation. CPI is just an index. It's a fixed basket of goods. It doesn't adapt. When prices go up, you change what you're going to buy. You change how you buy it. You change where you buy it. You decide, instead of buying this premium good, I'll buy something that's a little lower quality because, I'm still gonna buy the product. CPI ignores that and says, this is the basket of goods forever. So what happens is that if anything within that basket changes, it just pushes the numbers up. So if we look at the chart here on the left, this is the last 12 months of what's happened within CPI. So when I tell you CPI has risen, well, gas has gone up by 50%. Well, okay. So you may have changed your driving behaviors. You could change all kinds of different things around gasoline. Used cars and trucks. So check out the chart on the bottom right. This is the used car price change from year over year. Used cars has actually been driving, pardon the pun, the numbers you're seeing in CPI. When we look at the rest of this chart, energy prices, which connects to oil, so gas, and we were kind of double counting there a little bit, but okay. But everything else has been fairly low in comparison to the basket of goods. And so when we look at the upper chart here on the right-hand side, we just unpack some of these energy prices within the rise in CPI, we can see where all items lumped together, we see this relatively lower amount. But then when we look at gas and natural gas, it's really high. So CPI is not the number you think it is. It has nothing to do with what you as a household may actually be experiencing, or you as a business may actually be experiencing. Because I'm guessing as an apartment building, you don't buy a lot of gas, right? I mean, maybe natural gas, okay, depending on how you're doing your lease and your utilities, but you're not going to the local gas station every week to fill up the tank in the building. So your exposure to inflation is different than what you're going to see in CPI. And this is one of those pieces where it's really hard to divorce the headline to, well, how does this actually affect me? So when we look to inflation ahead, and I put maybe here because we've got some extracurricular activities happening in parts of the world. But the chart on the left is the Federal Reserve forecast for inflation. So you can see here over quarter, the trajectory of or shape of the forecast has changed. It's definitely gotten steeper. The level of inflation is expected, but also notice that the shape on the decline has not changed either. We're expecting to see this massive depressurization within inflation by the end of the calendar year. Now, when I say that, you won't realize it until probably the first part of the new year, because it takes a while for the numbers to catch up with reportables. But you should be expecting to see the inflation numbers starting to drop relatively soon, because it's being held up not because of structural issues, but because of fundamental supply issues, and that's partly what's driving that up. The fancy chart here on the right is looking just at CPI, the different components of it. So core inflation, food, energy, and kind of seeing where that's shifting. And so you're seeing that the energy prices fall back down. You're seeing food prices remaining somewhat stable, and you're seeing the core inflation dropping quickly as well. So we're expecting to see those declines in very specific areas, just like we've seen the increases come in very specific areas. So that brings me to inflation and you. Pardon me. So you should look for how inflation impacts you in real terms. Really think about what is it that's impacting your business in terms of inflation, and consider if that's something you can manipulate, right? Can I wait to make that purchase or investment? Does that make more sense than doing it now? Lumber is a great example. So when we look at lumber, and that's your bottom left chart here, we look at the price of lumber, and it is obvious that there are supply chain problems in lumber, right? And we've seen massive supply chain issues in lumber from all kinds of different perspectives, everything from steel tariffs affecting the train cars and the trucks that move it, to actual tariffs being put in place, to resin shortages for plywood. I mean, there's been all kinds of really obtuse problems in the lumber market that's caused that. So the thing you want to watch is the lumber futures, which is the fancy way to think about lumber. And so we're able to kind of really think about how that market's going to work. The fact of the matter is lumber has to return back to somewhat of a normal level at some point in the near future, because, and again, the demand for lumber is somewhat consistent. It has seasonality to it, but it's not subject to wide spikes because there's not enough construction labor to cause that to happen. And so absent some natural disasters, and of course, fires are definitely one of the reasons we've seen lumber go up, we expect lumber to come back down. So if I had a huge project and I could delay it by 4, 5, 6 months, I probably would on just basis on lumber, because the forecasts are for lumber futures to kind of fall back. And again, get your pencil out and you can kind of look at where the trend line is there. It's pretty consistent. Gas is a really good example of using this logic very poorly. So again, one of my as much as CPI is my pet peeve, America's like absolute fascination with pump gas prices just kill me. So the chart here on your right is a share of consumer spending on gasoline and other energy as a percentage of their total spending. Get your pencil out. You're spending less. You're spending less money since 1960 on gas. In fact, if I express the price of gas in real dollars, so in today's dollar values, gas is around the same price as it was in 1935 from a time series. Yes, it goes up and down. There are times it goes up a little bit and there's times it comes down. Gas, and all the headlines, gas is at a record price. No, actually, gas has been more expensive 3 times since 1970 than it is today in real dollar sense, by a lot. So but it feels big, and it does. I get it, right? If something's cost you $2 today and it's $4 tomorrow, it feels like it's a lot. But what you don't realize is that $2 from the other day is actually $5 today. And so that's the problem with numbers and us as a people. And then we also need to consider Fed policy on this in this equation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So workforce, we had great workforce data come out today about job openings and people accepting work and people moving jobs. And I obviously I didn't include the slides because it came out this morning, but there's a lot to unpack within workforce because it gets complex, and it's been shifting for a long time. What happened in the last 2 years is we kind of rocketed forward 10, 15, 20 years as far as where the labor force was going. And so that's hard. That's a lot of change all at once. And it makes a lot of people queasy. So let's take a look at that. So on the left here, this is the change in labor force participation rate. So unemployment is one of those numbers that's also misleading. To be unemployed, I need to be of working age, and I need to have been actively looking for work, right? If I'm not actively looking for work, I fall out of the equation. So I quit my job and I don't actively look for work. I am neither employed nor unemployed. I'm no longer in the percentage. And so I can wind up with a very low unemployment rate and a lot of people not in the workforce, which is exactly where we are now. So this chart on the left is labor force participation. This is just the people ages, in this case, it's 25 to 34. A lot of times we'll roll this forward to 55, 60, and we see the same trends. But we can see we start out at 0, which is where we were 2 years ago, and then people fell out of the workforce. They're not looking for work. They're just not going to work, and they're done for a lot of different reasons. And so we can see in this chart, we see men and women, and we've divided these charts up by race. We've done it by region of the country. We've done all kinds of different analyses around this, and the trends kind of hold up. When I look at the US civilian labor force change from February, that's this on the top right, we see women have not come back into the labor. So it's a different way to look at the same data that we're looking at that other chart. Men are actually, there's more than there was back in February. Interesting. Okay. And then when we look at the lower chart here, change in employment and child daycare services. Do you suppose there's a connection possibly between a lack of childcare and women not being in the workforce? Maybe just a little bit. Yeah. And again, the question that we have to ponder as economists are, how much of this is a structural change, permanent, that people have decided, you know what, we used to both go to work, and then we realized in the pandemic that my partner, at the end of the day, they were contributing a couple $100 a month to our family budget because we were spending it all on childcare. That's not a good deal. Let's not do that anymore. Or they found their kids did better in homeschooling or remote schooling than they did in a classroom setting. So they've decided they're going to do that instead. There's a lot of options, and there's a long laundry list, honestly, of reasons why this is happening. And so the question that we have to ponder is, does the daycare industry change structurally because of all this? Does the demand drop? Now, obviously, they already have way more demand than they have capacity. So this has to come up from a labor force perspective, but how much becomes a valid question. Let's see, we got some questions, Candace. Let's see here. Prices are going up, corporate profits are also rising. How much is margin expansion of corporations versus supply chain constraints? You know, there's a term, Jamie, with in politics, we call it taking out the trash. Friday afternoon at the White House, they take out the trash. They do the same thing in the Capitol building. They take out all the news stories no one wants to hear about. Companies do the same thing too. They take out the trash. So here's an opportunity to raise prices. So they do. And they raise prices more than what they might actually think they need to at the moment in time, because they're not sure when they're going to be able to get the chance to do it again. But the other problem is that when the manufacturer raises a price, the next person raises their price, the next person raises their. So you get this collision, everyone raising their prices. So yes, corporate profits are really high. Is that going to last? That's a really good question. I'm not convinced that corporate profits will stay as high, because we saw in the last couple of weeks places saying, well, you know, we're gonna increase our base wages to $20+ an hour. And I laugh because I remember all the debates about how $15 an hour was going to put everyone out of business. And I think Target announced $23 as a minimum wage for some of their roles last week. So maybe we'll have a different conversation about wages.
There's another question, James, about wages in the Q&A. You're saying that clarify inflation statement from earlier. You said it raises wages, but then you said that the price of gasoline at record highs is actually very low. So why isn't that true of wages? The price of labor goes up like gasoline, but in fact it's lower than 20 years ago in real dollars.
Yeah, so it's a different metric, right? So when we look at the wages in wages in real dollars are lower, right? I mean, we've had so that the statistics that we often share is that since the mid 70s, and again, there's going to be outliers to this, so I'm going to put a little asterisk and ask you to rely on that. But since mid 70s, people without a college degree have seen a year-over-year drop in wages in real dollar sense. So even though gasoline, for example, in real costs may be dropping as well, it's not dropping at the same rate. And so the households are having less dollars to work with. And so that takes it's the real dollars thing is kind of a fun one to play with, to figure out really what's going on with real dollars and understanding kind of what's happening. But wages, we saw the initial really good spike in wages, but in terms of real dollars, wages are below where they were before the pandemic at this point on average, even though there's been these massive increases.
Hmm.
And it's part just because inflation has had this big spike. Now, as inflation settles back down, will that resolve? Something's got to give, because in these two charts right here, on the left is unemployment. We're at record, pretty low unemployment rates. When we look at the natural rate of unemployment, or where's maximum employment, right? So you're never going to have 100% of people employed. They can't all be working because people are changing jobs. It creates too much friction. And so we always have to have this, the rule always is, oh, it's 5%. That's not quite true. As you can see in this chart on the right, it's actually between 4 and 5%. It kind of depends. There's a math equation that happens here, but you can see we're actually below what's considered to be full employment. That also creates inflationary pressure, because suddenly now I have to pay more to get people to change jobs. And so this is where this all happens together. And this is what happens when you have a decreasing workforce participation rate. We just have less people in the workforce than we had. And so it causes this really low unemployment, this really full employment base, and this inflationary pressure on wages. And it takes us to some hard conversations. It also means some people are going to come back to the workforce, right? Because Candace decides she was out, and then she gets offered a job that's 40% more money, and she's like, well, all right, I'll go back for a little while, I guess. And so that'll happen in the workforce.
So there is a quick question clarifying, whether inflation can be good because it rises wages, but then this particular question is about living through the late 70s, not recalling seeing that much inflation creating an overall increase in quality of life or improved standards for the poor. And I think you get into this a little bit.
Yeah, and Bob's asking a really good question here, because remember I talked about how we've had no inflation since. Inflation's been held really low. That held wages low. There was no wage pressure. And so you saw that structural spike in the 70s, and then no real recovery from that because there was no wage pressure. So the wage pressure is what we're getting out of the current inflation thing. So my expectation is we're going to continue to see wages rise and see some real wage growth out of this in the next year or two. But it's going to be hit and miss. Some people are going to get it and some people aren't. But what's been good at this point from an economics perspective is it's been the lower paying jobs that are seeing the wage pressure much more than the higher end jobs. It's why a lot of restaurants and places that have historically low wages have really struggled to find people, because frankly, people can find other work that fits their needs better and has a better total fit for them. So we're going to see a lot of structural challenges around labor and some of those lower paying industries in the next couple of years ahead. I pulled this slide out, and we're not going to spend time on this. I just want to make you aware of this. We talk a lot about immigrants in our country, and I want you to look at, as we talk about a lowering workforce participation rate, I want to make you aware of that we have seen a pretty significant drop in the number of foreign-born workers in the United States. This is a challenge when we think about from a workforce participation rate. And again, get your pencil out and look at the trend line here, because the drop is far greater than it looks when you first just eyeball this chart. It's a big gap. And expect this conversation to come back up again. At some point, this will become a conversation that people are willing to have, that we need to actually think more astutely around how we fuel workforce in the United States. So the next piece of the puzzle is the shifting place of work. The definition of where people are working is changing. And of course, it depends on the type of work, right? I mean, if I work for in an Amazon warehouse, I have a very different conversation than if I'm a coder for Amazon, because I can't work from home if I'm putting stuff in boxes. That doesn't work. Normally I pick on Target, but today I'll go with Amazon. But currently we're thinking that we'll see about a 60% return to daily office for the workers that have the ability to at least partially work remote. That 60% works out to about 3 days a week. And it's going to really vary. We have companies that are saying absolutely not. We're just not going to go back to the office ever. And we've got some other offices saying, oh, we want everyone back Tuesday. And so we're going to see some variations there, but on average, we expect to see about a 60% return. So let's talk about what that looks like. So in the bottom left here, this is the chart that Castle put together, and Castle's is a key card company that does major buildings all over the country. So they are at about a 38% return to normal over the last 2 years. So these offices, think about lawyer offices, think about buildings like 2 Union Square in Seattle, right? Like these are going to be professional offices, more likely to have the ability to work remote. They're at about 38% at this point. But look at everything else, right? You've got movie box offices at 60%, Open Table at 80%. So going out to eat. TSA is at 91% for their checkpoints. People are not going back to work. They're doing other stuff. We're seeing mobility. They're not going back to the office. And so that 60% return is going to be a really interesting thing to watch. And for you as a property owner, that means you have to really think about what renters or owners want in those facilities. What's going to make it so that they can, do that work remote, have the work-life balance, have the attributes and things that they're going to want around them and provided to them. It's also going to impact where they want it. So on the right here, this is the top 50 metro areas for creative class workers in 2019. So this is where we were pre-pandemic. And you notice that the Seattle market, Western Washington is one of those spaces. Portland's one of those spaces. That's not a big shock. The question is going to be, and we'll get into a little bit of this in the next couple slides, but the real question is going to be, how does this map change? Because if I'm 100% remote, I might decide to move somewhere else entirely. If I'm 60% remote, I'm going to stay relatively close. So it'll be interesting to see how this one works as far as how it affects movement. So Fed policy, and I know all of you probably stay up late at night studying Fed policy because, man, it's exciting. They do this thing called a dot plot. And that's what I want to show you here. So when the Fed board governors get together, they all make their guesses. And I'm going to say guess. I mean, that they would say forecast. They make their predictions on where things are going to go as far as rates and other types of things. So this is the dot plot from in mid-December. And you can see the groupings and kind of how that's plugging together. And you can see how they were expecting to see this rise for the Fed funds rate. And so the question for you is not if the Fed raises rates, but how much and how often. So you've read stuff about, there's the rate increase this month that, maybe we'll have 6 increases in the next year. Maybe we'll have 3. And, people start freaking out because they're like, I better refinance. I better, maybe. Our guess is that the Fed is trying to play it safe. They're not going to raise rates quickly because we've had that experience, right? So, I mean, if we go back into the 80s, we've had the experience when the Fed overreacted and caused recessions and caused real structural problems in the United States from really high interest rates. So we expect them to kind of play it safe and play it carefully. And either we'll judge them as brilliant or judge them as idiots here in another couple of years. But we have a concern that if they raise it too quickly, we've got other things going on in the economy that are actually slowing the economy down. And so if you're going up a hill and you take your foot off the gas, how hard do you press the brakes, right? Becomes the question. And that's where the Fed's at on this. So you want to think about the cost of capital. That should have your attention. And then it's the cost of lending, or the rates, really act as a balancing act with property values. So if rates go up, property values have to slow their ascent or stall their ascent to catch up with wages or monetary availability to do that. So it's just something to be aware of in your own thinking process. So regional implications. So if we start looking a little bit closer to home, population growth is really going to matter for our region. We've had a lot of really interesting things happen around our region from a population growth perspective. And it's something we're digging into right now because we lost a ton of jobs, right? We saw like a 45% drop in employment at the beginning of the pandemic. How many of those jobs come back becomes a really fundamental question, because that tells us a lot about population. And that also tells us about demand for residential and commercial properties and the underlying values and rents and all that kind of stuff. So population growth really matters. And where that population growth happens really matters. So that's something that we're keeping our eye on pretty closely. Residential inventory has shown recent increases. We saw a 30 to 45% increase month over month in residential inventory recently. And I'm not going to go deep in this because we've got other speakers. But this price pressure should drop as inventory and rates increase. And so again, we should see some pricing stability come into the marketplace that we haven't seen, which actually may be helpful in a lot of different ways. It's also going to make some people feel like they may have missed the boat. They didn't get 50 offers, they only got 10. But there's a lot of good things that are going to happen there, I think, overall because of it. And then mobility and cost of living topics are also things that we really have to kind of think about as we go in there. So let's talk about mobility. Next slide. So there's several types of mobility for us to consider. The first is, there's several types of mobility. What does the COVID recovery mobility look like? People just returning to normal, people going back to the office and going to ball games. And well, I guess we can't go to baseball and we can't, maybe ball games aren't a good example anymore. A lot of people crying over Seahawks this morning. So as people return to that, whatever their new normal or a normal set of daily activities looks like, it's going to, we got to think about mobility in that sense. We need to think about people moving to new locations, near or far, and the motivations are going to matter. And then we need to think about cost of living on top of inflation. We have regional differences in what it costs to live wherever it is people go. So when we think about COVID mobility, I pulled this yesterday. This is the mobility forecast, and it's showing that we're expected to see a full return to normal levels of mobility. And that's measured by just movement of people. They use cell phone data and a bunch of other stuff to figure this out. But by early May, we're expecting to see this return back to whatever normal was. But the patterns are going to be different, right? So you need to think about that. You need to think about, we should see more robust downtown type activities, whatever that means. But this is going to be very dependent on consumer sentiment. And the challenge I have right now with all of the COVID models is that the Washington State COVID model is relying on a 70 to 80% masking level, which for a lot of people ends on Saturday. So the next month is going to be really interesting. I like using that. It's going to be really interesting to see if consumer confidence and consumer sentiment continues this trajectory, or if we have people say, I'm going to just hold up and wait for a little bit more. So we could see this get pushed out. We'll know in a month. So people movement data is the biggest challenge with people movement. We know that most movements happening within MSAs, 80% of people moving in King County are within the MSA. So they might be moving to Woodinville, they might be moving to Auburn, but they're moving within the MSA. But the movement to rural areas is statistically significant. It's a big deal when someone moves from Lake City to Marysville. Right? The denominator in those communities is very different. You have a very different level number of people. We always joke in Whatcom County that if 10 people move from Seattle, it's like everyone's moving from Seattle because it's a huge percentage, right? When it's just not. And MSA is a metropolitan statistical area. That's a great question. I'm sorry, I try not to speak in acronyms. And MSA, so the Seattle MSA is Snohomish, King, Pierce, and Kitsap counties. So pre-COVID data census flow mapper, so just Google census flow mapper. It's a really cool map. The problem is it's all pre-COVID data, but you can see where people move from and to around the United States at a county level. 2020 forward requires different data sets. We tend to use the post office movement data, but there's a ton of them out there, right? There's different moving Atlas van lines has an index. The pod storage people have an index. Just remember, there's a lot of selection bias in their data sets. That's why we use the post office, because it's a little more unbiased. So expensive cities are likely to see lower growth rates, while mid-priced nearby locations are expected to see a higher growth and higher price pressures. That also means the rents are going to rise in those nearby locations as well, because they're going to have a lot more pressure into those spaces. And also looking for creative. I know in our work with some cities on the fringes of Seattle, they're looking at different ways to have multifamily or higher density areas constructed in their communities. Next, there we go. Cost of living. Cost of living just compares relative dollar power, and it's way more telling than CPI and those things. So if we set the U.S. average for a basket of goods to $1, then King County's at $1.57, Washington State's $1.30, Idaho is 99 cents. It's on sale. California is $1.43. That's if we normalize the data set. And so we're part of a study that does this 3 times a year. We actually price out 5 counties in Washington State to get this data. So this is a really good data. And this is so the thing that you have to remember though is cost of living is relative to earnings. The reason it's less expensive to live in Idaho is they pay less. Pay is less, so therefore the costs are less as well. And so you get this relativity that happens and so this becomes very relevant if I can draw King County pay and live somewhere else. Like if I can live in Cle Elum, one of the cheapest communities, not Cle Elum, but that part of the state, Yakima, etc., one of the cheapest areas in Washington State to be, but get paid out of the most expensive area, I start to see that kind of movement a lot. So we got to really think hard about mobility and cost of living. All right, so that brings us to the close of my discussion today. Candace, do we have any more talks? Any more chats?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions that I've put together over the course of your presentation. One thing that I heard you talking about was inflation and how we always talk about sort of gas prices and how that has sort of a limited effect on rental housing providers, whereas something like lumber has a much greater effect. It seems like they're, because you're not buying gas as an apartment owner, certainly you're not affected directly, but there probably are effects as it relates to vendors and suppliers and things like that. So there are, do you want to expand on that anymore?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll get you an honorary economics degree here before you're done. No, that's exactly it, right? You really have to, we're doing a bunch of work right now with some organizations, helping them understand the cost structure of their suppliers so that they understand why things cost what they cost, right? It's just to help them kind of understand other people's business models and what's fair. And so you really have to think about what is fair. If a painter comes and says, well, it's going to cost $30,000 to paint this, and you're like, oh, you got to be kidding. Try to understand why it costs that much money. And it may make sense and it may not make sense. And then you know how to move forward.
Right. Another element that I heard you mention was about sort of the varying opinions on interest rate growth through the course of this year. Certainly at the beginning of the year, it seemed like we were going to, according to Jamie Dimon, we were going to get 8 increases over the course of the year. Everyone was sort of thinking 4, starting in March and quarterly. And now with some of the socioeconomic and geopolitical issues, it almost seems like that expectation is waning. Do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, we expect not to, I mean, our crystal ball, which, it is what it is at this point, but we're not expecting the kind of rate increases that most people are kind of, frothing over. We don't expect to see the 6 rate increases. I mean, we could, right? I mean, we could see, based on emerging situations, we could see more of those rate increases, but from everything we're looking at right now, we don't see it. We're not sure that even more than 1 or 2 makes sense. Because they're concerned about inflation, and inflation is going to resolve itself without their interaction to all the forecasts at this point.
Right.
So tapping the brakes, they could actually cause a far worse financial problem by doing it than not doing it. And so it's hard.
And then a question from the audience: why is enormous government debt not a structural issue problem?
Debt's one of those funny things. And so one of my, a lot of us go back and say, well, in my household, if I can't pay my if I have all this debt, it's a challenge. And typically it's not the debt that's the problem, it's the servicing of the debt, right, in your household. And again, I have to preface, your household budget works very differently than a government budget. So there is no one-to-one. The lessons you learn at home don't work in government. Same thing in nonprofits. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also some really key differences. So the reality is that government debt, and this is a highly controversial topic for amongst people, but it's the servicing of the debt that becomes the important part. Also, we get lost sometimes in who owns the debt and what does that debt really mean. The reality is a lot of people are using that as a reserve. It's a function of a reserve currency, right? So they're using it as insecurity. It's not the type of debt like your Visa card is. The question we should be asking is, what are we using that debt for? And is that really are we getting a return on that debt, right? When you buy a house or buy an apartment building, there's an ROI on that debt. If you go to the local burger place and spend $1 million on burgers and put it on your Visa card, not a lot of return on the burgers. And so the discussion really should be, what are we buying with those dollars? And are we going to see a return on it?
Other than a return on your waste in the case of
the burgers, right? The burger philosophy. Candace, because you're going to cut me off here, I just want this slide up here. We post a ton of stuff out into social media every day. And so if you're looking for kind of a filtered viewpoint of what kind of things we're reading and thinking about, give us a follow on social media. I also put our email up here if you have questions. We like those. And we also publish the Economic Forecaster, which is a regional publication. And you can get more information about that online as well.
Thank you so much, James. It's always a pleasure hearing your perspectives. Really appreciate that. Mel has a question, but I'm going to save that one if that's okay, because I know that Dylan's presentation will go into that. So next up, we have Jamie Nacht going over single-family investment trends. Welcome, Jamie, and look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Candace. So just to give a little bit of overview, we founded a firm called Havium that really helps people acquire, own, operate, sell, or exchange single-family rental property from a passive standpoint. And so we really focus on this space, in the single-family investment space. And so I'm going to go over kind of what's going on in the single-family world, particularly where we are right now, how we got to the situation that we're in, and what our expectations are, and then what trends we're seeing in the market. And so where are we right now? As of right now, nationally, there's less than 2 months of supply on the market. It's starting, as James referenced, is starting to get better, but Washington is a little bit more challenged than the national market. So as you can see here, Washington has about 0.6 months of supply. So supply is just a factor of how many properties are selling or going pending over the course of the month versus how many properties are actually available. In this case, what that 0.6 means is if we stopped putting houses on the market, within about 2 weeks and change, all the houses would be sold. So it's just not a good place to be. And if you're trying to figure out how that trend has happened, in 2019, we had 2.4 months of supply. By 2020, at the same time in January, we had 1.5 months of supply. And we've really dropped below that 1 month of supply, which is where you start to see these big imbalances between supply and demand. So you have lots and lots of buyers, and you just don't have enough inventory for buyers to buy and investors to invest in. And so you start to see just some crazy behavior, which I'll go over. So also on that inventory piece is the total active listings. And you can see that another way to look at that inventory is how much total active listings are available. And we've just been getting a smaller and smaller and smaller number year over year. We just get little tiny chunks taken out of our inventory and it doesn't get replaced. And as a result, we just have a crazy buying market that has a lot of appreciation built into it because there's so much competition and there's a fierce amount of dollars looking for investment, and single family homes are, or residential real estate in general, is used as an inflation hedge for a lot of investors. So how did we get here? This slide looks at the total US market. And really, what I like to highlight in this slide is to understand how many homes are being built as the US population grows. So the green bars going left to right from the year 2001 show that every year we're adding somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million new people to the US population. And we were building a lot, some would say too much, going into the 2007-2008 timeframe. And then, as everybody remembers, bad lending behavior and some bad behavior just in the general market caused the whole housing market to kind of collapse in 2007-2008. And when that happened, builders stopped building and they laid off a bunch of their tradespeople. And so you saw the inventory, the amount of new homes being added to the inventory, drop off dramatically. But at the same time, the housing or the population in the US just kept growing. And so we were building this shortage of supply for the new residents or new population. From 2008, 2009, all the way to 2015, 16, we were accruing a larger and larger deficit, a larger and larger shortage of houses. In the neighborhood of 500 to 900,000 houses being built, and a shortage of 300 to 700,000 houses that we just needed but weren't building. And so even over the subsequent years, we're just now catching up to most economists would say somewhere between 1.25 million to 1.4 million houses need to be built to just keep up with the demand. And so this chart now takes a look at just that months of supply. So you can see that red line is just the adjusted average. That's where if you have an appropriate number of houses on the market to meet demand, you're going to have a supply-demand balance. And that helps buyers and sellers kind of sit on a level playing field. So you don't have these crazy markets like we've been in for the last several years where one house goes on the market and then it has 15 people come in and go crazy trying to buy it. When you look at this, the period that deals with 2007 to like 2012, it's kind of an odd period. Part of that period is because we built too much coming into 2008. And then the remainder of that period is nobody wanted to buy because, from a boots on the ground standpoint, you don't want to buy a property today that might be worth less tomorrow. And that was when the market was still kind of falling and trying to correct itself. Now, this is the US market. If we jump to the next slide, the housing market in the state of Washington had a really compounded effect for this. So we had a big problem where 2007, it was a very quick, we jumped up, we had too much inventory, the market tried to clear itself. By 2013, we had kind of corrected and come back to what is a normalized market. But by 2015, we really started to see that supply-demand imbalance shift. And if we jump to the next slide, this really focuses on that, just the last 10 years. So in the state of Washington, we usually have a balanced market with somewhere around 3.5 months of supply. If you have 3.5 months of supply versus the national 4 months of supply, you have a decent amount of supply on the market so that buyers aren't bumping into each other and clobbering, every seller with 10 to 15 offers. Now, we've been in a really tough time because once you get to about 2 months of supply, we start to see some kind of crazy behavior in the buying market. We have been, if you look at that period of the last, from late 2019 to present, we've been under 1 month. And for the last 18 months, we've been under a half a month of supply. We've been right around a half a month supply. And that's why you're seeing these crazy trends. Like we have, King County year over year, based on the MLS data that came out recently, King County average prices were up, over 20%. And even in the secondary markets, we're looking at like a 8 to 15% year over year price change on average. And so what's driving this is that supply demand imbalance and the underbuilding. We tried to figure out internally, just looking at all the census data, what's the appropriate number of houses to be building. So we kind of backed it out and said, okay, if we have a certain number of adults over the age of 30, how many houses did there used to be when there was normalized markets? And in the 80s, for every 2 adults, there was 1 single family detached house. Now it's fallen to, there's for every 3 adults, there's a single family detached house. So we need to kind of correct that behavior. Some of that is just people moving to cities and multifamily or larger condo developments, but a lot of it, particularly as we get this millennial and Gen Z wave of people that are having household formations, they're moving into these, single family detached houses, and they're just eating up all the supply.
And there's a comment from the audience, Jamie, saying rising new houses may still not be keeping up and we might still be in a squeeze. Do you feel like that's the case?
I do. I will get to that. I'll kind of speak to that point in my tail slide about my expectations. But yeah, we do see that, there's just challenges in the building market. And even if we got our act together, we would still be in a market that has a shortage for a number of years. And so what are investors seeing? What are we seeing? And I mean, investors, along with anybody that's just trying to buy single family homes, we're seeing that the market has been crazy. I think everybody's aware of how crazy the market's been. It's been national news for quite a while. We're still seeing it. It's come down a little bit, but we're still seeing that if there is a attractive, well-priced, high-quality property, that sellers are expecting to see offers generally within a day. I think you're seeing a little bit of calming on that, but we're still seeing it. I mean, within a day, 2 days, things are going on and off the market very, very quickly if the properties are priced correctly. We're seeing some behavior that I'm not a huge fan of. So waived contingencies were a real common thing in 2020 or 2021. We're starting to see a little bit better behavior there. King County kind of led the charge just by practice of, rather than waiving contingencies, sellers were encouraged to get their properties inspected in advance. Waiving contingencies hosts a whole ton of problems, liability problems for buyers and sellers. But sellers were being given, advice that, hey, you can get a buyer to waive everything because there's so much competition. We haven't seen that echo into the secondary market very quickly. So we're still seeing secondary market sellers thinking that they can get away with selling with waived financing, waived inspections. I expect that to change in the near term as rate hikes go up and buyer pricing, buyer power goes down, that I think that you'll start to see that. We're seeing some things that are consistent. We are seeing release of earnest money just to improve an offer's quality or perceived quality by a seller. Seller leasebacks were also really common. So where a seller is selling a property and they say, well, I want to stay in here for 2 months and I want to stay in rent free. I have a very strong stance on this, which is I'm not a big fan of it. But it was really common in the 2021 range. And I think we're still seeing a little bit of that, but to a lesser degree. The higher interest rate or the interest rate hikes that we're seeing and anticipating are starting to get built into the market pricing and behavior, but it's causing behavior or urgency for buyers and sellers. So sellers are looking at their homes and saying, oh, if the rate goes up higher, a buyer isn't going to be able to afford, a high price because they're just going to have a higher monthly payment. And buyers are looking at it and saying, hey, I need to get in and lock this, my rate on my purchase before rates get even higher and eat into my returns or eat into my monthly cash flow if it's my primary residence. And tight closing timelines are just part and parcel with where we live in the market right now. We are seeing, so I want to make sure that I address that we get asked a lot, and we've gotten asked for a couple of years now, what do we expect in terms of if there's going to be another correction like 2007, 2008? We don't think that. If you look at what led to 2007, 2008, it was really a function of poor lending behavior. As far as we see, most buyers, the grand majority, are prime borrowers or super prime borrowers, meaning they have credit scores of 700 to 760 or 800 and above, or they're buying all cash. So we just don't see the bad buying behavior or bad lending behavior as much now, which means that if you buy a property and there is a slowing of appreciation or even a correction of some degree, it will likely be a smaller correction or a stabilization of rent home price increases, which lends to a sturdier market. And so we're not looking at like some crazy corrections. We are seeing some behavior just reported by our property managers that renters are seeking where they were considering becoming buyers at the end of their lease. They're renewing at a higher percentage, and that they're renewing and requesting for potentially longer leases of 18 to 24 months versus a standard 12-month lease. And then we just like to guide, based on what we've seen historically, there does appear to be a correlation between home price appreciation and rent increases. And it's a function of, we view it as that home price appreciation is a leading indicator for rent increases. And it really is a function of the fact that housing is binary for the end user. So you either rent your house or you buy your house. And if you're getting priced out of the purchase market, you're finding yourself into the rental market. And so the more people that get priced out, the bigger the size of people looking for rentals, which just drives demand up. And when demand goes up, as James knows very well, it's just where demand meets supply, and you see the price rise. And so as far as speaking to the question that Candace had brought up, so when we kind of run our models, if we could magically bring the home building market to full capacity and have all the labor and tradespeople and materials available to start building, it would take us, just to recover from this shortage that we've accrued, it would take us about 5 years to build enough to rebalance that market. The problem is from 2008 to 2015, we saw, because the home builders stopped building, they laid off a lot of that workforce, and a lot of the tradespeople moved into other places or retired. And so now there's a shortage of tradespeople that are qualified and capable of doing the jobs that are necessary to build. And so to bring that labor force back up, and the materials challenges that we've had just with supply constraints, we expect that there's going to be about a 7 to 10 year tailwind on single family homes. And I hope that the interest rate hikes will curb this kind of maniacal behavior when it comes to appreciation that's double-digit appreciation year over year over year. But I do expect it to fall back to the long-term averages, particularly in the state of Washington. The long-term averages, which we view as 4.5% to 5.2% per year on average, assuming that there's a 10-year cycle for real estate. So if you buy a house at year 0 and you sell at year 10, you should average somewhere in the 4.5% to 5.2% appreciation per year.
And Jamie, have we got time for a couple questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple coming from the single family home perspective. One person is considering kind of renting out or selling their house in the Green Lake area, and wondered if there was a better time to sell now or rent it and sell it later, and what your thoughts on that are. And then also kind of future value of Seattle single family homes given crime and some of those issues. So I thought I'd couple those together.
Yeah, I'll speak to the first one, which is it depends on what you're going to do with the proceeds of that purchase or that home. Because if you're gonna sell a home and try to rebuy somewhere else, if you're gonna 1031 exchange an asset, it removes a little bit of that kind of warble, because you're buying and selling in the same market. You have a very tight window to do it. And so there's not really a good time to buy or sell, assuming that the market isn't stalled like it did in 2008 for like, 2 months. If you're going to take your money off the table, I think that the market will continue to go up a little bit. As far as rentals, just speaking specifically to King County, our firm doesn't really focus on investment in King County, largely because there's a lot of challenges to primary markets like Seattle when it comes to the imbalance between landlord-tenant laws. So there's a lot more power in a primary market for tenants versus landlords. You see this in other big markets like New York or San Francisco, where it's kind of painful to be a landlord in those markets because there's lots of challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But as far, what was the second question, Candace?
Oh, just the future value given an increasing crime in the Seattle market. And I've got 2 other questions as well. So
sure. I think that the national press is really focused on Seattle, the crime rate in Seattle, and I think reasonably so. I think it's just something that needs to be worked out. It kind of falls to the challenges that the Seattle City Council has. I personally wouldn't be investing my own money into the Seattle market for a rental property because of those challenges. But I do think that Seattle is going to be there for a long time, knock on wood. I mean, we have lots of great employers. We're a phenomenal market. We're a great place to live. Anybody that comes here during the summer gets inevitably tricked into moving here because they get to see all the beautiful weather and the mountains and the water. So I think, there's not a huge amount of risk tied to it, but I think that there's going to be some challenges over the next 2 to 3 years as the Seattle market kind of cleans up and has its police force kind of readjusted and all those things.
okay, and then quickly, there used to be about 20% down was sort of what you could pay for a cash flowing property. Do you have sort of a default down payment formula you'd recommend for a property that you feel like it's balanced out and worth investing in?
Yeah, we do. We basically target an assumed appreciation of that 4.5% over a 10-year hold, and we don't really pay attention to the down payment as much as we target, a comprehensive return of 10 to 14% targeted. We're seeing that to get those returns and to have a property that produces positive cash flow, we can't make it work with a 10% just because of what interest rates are. We can't make it work with a 20% down. So we're seeing our investors kind of target 35 to, as high as 50% down. But it's more because it's the efficiency of the invested dollar, not how limited what the smallest amount you can invest is. If that makes sense.
Yeah, great, awesome. Well, any other thoughts, or we can wrap it up for today, Jamie?
No, I think the only remaining thoughts I have are I think that we're going to have an interesting year. I think prices will probably continue to accelerate over 2022. There was an article in the New York Times 2 weeks ago about Spokane having a home price appreciation of 60% over the last 2 years. I think when you see stuff like that, you can expect that there's going to be a little chaos in the market. And like I said, the shortage of supply is going to be persistent. But overall, I would say that because of all the moving parts in the market, you can expect that good assets and good homes are going to draw sellers or buyers that are really interested in quality, and they're going to come with very heavy eagerness. And then you're going to see renters that are in the same position, where high quality renters are going to command a premium. So that's kind of our expectation for the next 12 to 24 months.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. Appreciate your thoughts and your great presentation. I think now we need to switch over to multifamily investment trends, and I'm pleased to introduce Dylan Simon. Hopefully you're here with us, Dylan.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you just great. Take it away.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's an honor to speak with everyone today. I'm really excited to hear what the other speakers had to say, and I'm going to have a fairly brief 20-minute presentation. I've reduced this down to what used to be about a 45 to 50-minute presentation. I believe all those slides are made available to everyone. So we're going to do some overview slides today. First, just a quick agenda of what we're going to cover today. First off, we've revamped our research. So our team is a team of 11 focusing on apartment sales for apartment buildings and land in really Western Washington. We just expanded to Eastern Washington as well. So we're covering pretty much everywhere east of the mountain. So our research is the 4 Western Washington counties: King, Snohomish, Pierce, and Kitsap. We're now doing quarterly research releases. Next up, content. We're covering all sales in the market, rental rates, and vacancy. So our research is it covers all of that. Again, 4 Western Washington counties, apartment buildings 5 units and up. Next up, as far as what we're covering is, I get a quick slide advance, or is just our analysis. What we've changed, the market's moving so quickly. So what we're doing with our research is looking at the last 90 days, what we call quarter over quarter, and the last 12 months, year over year. And so our research really goes back a number of years, but we're really focused on the quick changing market right now. And then finally, we have some special reports. We cover apartment development, and we do have a niche of micro apartments. And so we've sold nearly every micro apartment building out there. For those that are uninitiated, the average unit size of these apartments is around 200 square feet. It is a trend that's still alive and well. In fact, Seattle City Council is reconsidering allowing them to be built again. There was some legislation that changed up. So turning now to just a quick overview, other direction, pardon me. We'll have a regional overview. After the regional overview, submarket insights. We don't have time to cover all of those today. So we'll cover a couple of major markets just to give you a sense of the data we're provided. You should have a handout. It should be about 45 to 50 slides. So if you want to get through all of those, similar theme to what we're talking about today, but we'll let you cover those on your own. And then what we're going to end up with is a near-term forecast, what we really see what's going to happen in the next 9 to 12 months. And then we're going to take a little bit of a longer-term forecast of how we look at the region and how it's growing and what we expect for the apartment market. So first off, just looking at Puget Sound in general. So what this graph is, the last 15 years, you've got rent growth, which is the blue bars, and you've got vacancy rate, which is the red. So as apartment investors and owners, you'd like to see higher rent, lower vacancy. First click on here, what you'll see is we've had really steady rent growth throughout the market. So nice strong red or green line showing that pretty much since the last recession, 2009, we've had really strong rental rate growth in the Puget Sound region. If you look at the next click, you'll see there average rental rates in Puget Sound, $1,837, seems pretty high. A lot of that is based upon urban markets where rental rates are a little bit higher. We'll get King County next. And so what we're looking at is this really balancing rental rates versus vacancy rates. And so this yellow bar highlights, while we've been raising rental rates nearly every single year, year over year for the past 12 years, the vacancy rate's been pretty moderate. It's somewhere between 5 and 6.5%, 7%. Now that does include new supply. And so that skews it. So the real vacancy rate's probably been about 4 to 4.5%. But we've added about 6,000 to 8,000 units a year. So in the last decade, we've added about 80,000 units to the region. And that's why this vacancy rate's been a little bit higher. But what's remarkable, if you look at the next click, is our vacancy rate's the lowest it's ever been in the last 10 years. And our rental rates are the highest it's ever been. So sort of call it COVID be damned. Puget Sound region has survived really well. And there's been a lot of negative press about what's happened in the urban markets, especially in Seattle. And you take it across the West Coast and you can look at Portland, the west side of LA, San Francisco. But overall, our region has been extremely healthy and we're really on a trajectory to grow from here. So turning now next, looking a little bit more specifically to King County, looking at the next slide. King County, very similar dynamics, but the difference here in these slides are scaled the same as the blue bars are higher. The overall rent growth that's occurred this last decade has been much stronger in King County. So if you look at the next click, what it highlights is we've had this really strong green bar, but it wasn't continuous through COVID. And this is what happened in COVID, especially in these urban markets in Seattle, even in Bellevue, is rental rates dropped off. And you can see with the next click, we're looking at a fairly strong drop off. We saw a reduction in rental rates up to 15, almost 20% if you look at concessions that were added in the market. So we really saw King County suffer more than any other county. And for those of you that own apartment buildings in urban markets, you probably really a challenging 24 months. It was March 2020 when it really hit. Here we are 24 months later. 2020, the data really demonstrates that there was a big challenge in the market. Now, if you look at the next click, we see that rental rates popped back up. And I will be the first one to say, I've been prognosticating data for a number of years. I really didn't think that was going to happen until 2022. And really what I was focused on was the return to work. I figured once people got back to work, the offices were full and then apartments would be full. I'll be the first one to admit I was dead wrong, luckily in a good way, is we saw by mid-2021, the renters came back to the urban markets. And if you look the next click, you see what happened with vacancy rates. And one more click, you'll see vacancy has been fairly moderate through all of this. In COVID, you see that red circle, vacancy spiked. But if you look at the next click, vacancy is now down to pre-COVID levels. So once again, I think people were really negative on urban centers. We made Fox News quite a bit. Some of the images were real, some were not, but essentially they thought all of King County, especially in urban markets, was burning in 2020. Well, we did have a lot of challenges in our urban markets, but this was a really healthy result that rental rates popped back up to higher than pre-COVID levels and vacancy rates shot back down. And really, anyone who's owned in these markets really experienced this roller coaster this last 24 months. What's been really nice to see is the recovery happened a lot faster than we predicted it would happen. And as a result, the market's not only stabilized, it's actually gained some momentum in the marketplace. Now, again, these vacancy rates that you see here are a little bit more elevated in King County than the rest of Puget Sound. And that's really because we've just had more development in King County than we've had in Pierce, in Kitsap, and Snohomish. That is starting to change a little bit more now. But overall, King County had a pretty rough time, especially in the urban markets. But you can see where we are now. It's really healthy. One other thing I'll note, if you look at these rental rates, they're quite high. They're nearly $2,000 a month on average. Most of this is driven by the urban centers. But if you look at where San Francisco was the end of last cycle, call it summer, fall of 2019 pre-COVID, average rental rates in the Bay Area were getting close to $3,800 a month. And this is in the Bay Area and San Francisco, a cohort market. So they were literally double the rental rates. And at that same time, turning to single family, houses in the Bay Area were about 1.2 million. Now, we've seen huge home price appreciation, which you've heard from Jamie earlier, but our average home price in pre-COVID was about 650, getting up to 700. So that was half the Bay Area. So although our home prices have come up quite a bit, comparing King County to other urban markets, and when I'm talking about other urban markets, I'm talking about San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, New York, Boston. These are markets that the renter set has options to work for major employers. we are still a relatively affordable market if you look at the cost of living compared to wages. So moving to the next slide, we're going to go completely a different direction. One more click over is going to take us down to Pierce County. And this is sort of the tale of two markets. You saw King County rental rates were nearly 2,000. We saw vacancy was up to 5.2. Now, Pierce County, if you look at the first click here, looking at these blue bars, you're going to see that it wasn't until about 2011, 12, we saw some rent growth. But those blue bars, this is coming off of the Great Recession, they didn't really start picking up until 2015. It really was a muted response to the recovery from the Great Recession. And the great majority of this rent growth happened in the last 4 or 5 years in Pierce County. And this was a direct result of the cost of living in King County. People, renters moved south. And now we've seen a huge amount of what we call rent appreciation. Rent was below $1,000 a month up until 2015. And so we've seen rental rates really run up in Pierce County, but we've also seen investors get keen on the fact that rental rates are still under $1,500 a month. So it's a huge amount of savings for an apartment renter to go to Pierce County, but there's also a lot of room for owners if they choose to improve their property, raise rental rates, and increase income, they've been able to do so. And in going to the next, go through another click, good thumbs up rental rate. Next one over is we're taking a look at vacancy. And so this is really sort of what I call perfect curves on a graph. We've seen rental rates really pick up and vacancy really drop off. And so what's happened is Pierce County has been a highly desirable market. And in the last couple of years, you'll see in the next click that vacancy started to tick back up. And that's a direct response to rental rates coming up. So nothing different than we'd expect here when we look at the data is we've started to raise rental rates, vacancy has gone up. But what's really interesting is go to the next click. What's happened through COVID is rental rates have shot up. Each of those blue bars year over year has gone up 6 or 8%, especially from 2020 to 2021. But vacancy has plummeted down. So although apartment owners have pushed rental rates, increased the cost of rental rates, the response from renters is, we want to stay here. And rental rates have gone, or vacancy has gone, essentially, if you take out some noise in the market, it's gone around 3.5%. There's a little noise in this market. It ticked up a little bit, but it's really strong dynamics. Now, what this chart doesn't show is collection loss. What I mean by collection loss is non-paying tenants. And generally in the more urban areas, you have tenants that tend to pay their rent. They've been a little bit more sensitive to rental rate increases, but in some of the suburban markets, we have a little higher non-payment. So actual collections are a little bit lower. So there's a little bit of misdirection because we don't show non-payment here, but overall Pierce County has been extremely strong. And we didn't have time to go through all the slides, but if you look at the data that we provided, Kitsap County, similar dynamics, Snohomish County, similar dynamics. So these suburban markets have done extremely well through COVID. You can see continuously from 2019 through 2021, it's really, COVID has really impacted these markets positively in so much as rental increases and vacancy going down. And as we go to the next slide and we start talking about sales, you'll see the impact in sales.
Dylan,
So
can we go back to rental rates really quick? I've just got questions. Awesome. So one of the questions that came through is how much are increasing rental rates a function of higher end properties coming onto the market versus rental rate increases in like kind housing, right? So existing assets.
Yep. Fantastic question. And we revamped our research last year because I wanted a section on urban Tacoma. And we've seen in downtown Tacoma, we've seen a lot, for them, a lot of new product coming online, and that does skew the data. One of my favorite quotes attributed to Mark Twain is there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics. And so you've got to read between the lines of some of this data. If you look at the handout we provided, you'll see that rental rates in the more urbanized markets in Pierce County have shot up a lot more because of new construction. and the new construction really drives rental rates. But overall, because we're seeing apartment owners push rental rates $200-300 a month by updating their properties, improving their properties, and bringing in new renters, I'd say overall in Pierce County, the data is not that skewed because the entire inventory is pretty large compared to the actual amount of new construction. There's a couple thousand units coming online versus in King County, we've got 8,000 units coming online versus in Pierce, it's probably under 1,000 right now. So it is skewing the data a little bit, but not that much. What I will highlight, if you in RHA can distribute this, but all of our research, it's free. It's all published on our website. It's simonandersonteam.com, and you can get our research reports. All of our data goes through 2021. At the end of this month, we'll start on our Q1 data, and our last research report was about 80 pages. So if you have any insomnia, it's really helpful there. But you can break down in each of these markets by age of building and location of building and look at how the data may be skewed based upon what Candace brought up is some of the newer product is running at a higher rate.
Thanks, Dylan.
Absolutely. So turning now to sales, the actual sale of apartment buildings, this goes back 15 years, 16 years as well. You can follow the red line, which is the number of sales. The blue line is the actual sales volume. You can see beginning of the decade, we were doing pretty well. We hit the Great Recession, everything dropped off, and it's been a steady ramp up. We actually had the peak of the cycle way back in 2016. 2016 had the highest sales volume we've ever had of actual number or of dollars spent by investors, and still the highest number of transactions at just under 530 transactions for the entire year we've ever hit. What we didn't predict is 2019, there would be a change in the excise tax. And based on that change in the excise tax, a lot of owners, especially of larger buildings, wanted to sell those buildings before the excise tax hit and they hit their sales proceeds. What's been really fascinating with the next click is looking at what happened in 2021. I didn't think we'd get anywhere close to 2019 until the next cycle, maybe 2024 or 2025. We had a banner year of sales in 2021. Really, a lot of that was driven by institutional investors that spent very little money in 2020. The world got wealthier during COVID. At the high end, there was a lot of money to get spent. People were uncertain about the stock market. They wanted to put it into real estate, and it got funneled into more institutional sales. When I mean institutional sales, these are generally apartment buildings that are selling north of $50 million a building. That's why the number of transactions dropped down, but the sales volume increased. Turn to the next slide. What we're looking at is cap rates. One more click through, little thumbs up and down. So I'll get through this one quickly. If you do the next 4 clicks, what you'll see is this is the spread in cap rate. So red is King County, then Snohomish, Pierce, and Kitsap. You can see cap rates somewhere between 100 to 150 basis points, so 1 to 1.5% lower in urban markets. So you look at 2019, cap rates in King County are around 4.25, 4.5. You look in Kitsap, they're well over 6. Now, if you look at 2021, they all compressed down. And this is probably the most salient point about what's happened in the investment sales market is investors have had huge demand to go into suburbs, buy more suburban assets, and it's really shrunk down that we're in a 4 cap market across the board. 3.9 for King County. The spread here is about 70 basis points, so it's gone in half. So it's gone from a spread of a 4.5 cap to a 6 cap. It's now gone from a 4 cap to a 4.5 cap. So it really is investors wanting to invest into this market, and they've pushed pricing, which has pushed down cap rates. And so it's just a huge amount of demand in the investor community to own in our region. So going to the next slide, we'll just talk about the near-term trends. First is the urban core. I'm a work from home denier. I just don't think that's the way we're going to live. I think people are going to go back to urban centers, maybe not all of them, but a very high percentage. So I expect employers to come back to work By fall 2022, I expect we'll be at 75, 85% office occupancy. I think we'll get 90 plus. We're starting to see it every week. We're seeing more employers announce return of the urban core. Next up, suburbs. This happened last cycle because it got expensive to live in the urban core. People push out to the suburbs. The difference is we have a ton of people in the suburbs as well. So that's just going to increase rents in the suburbs as well. I am very bullish on this region. I come from California. I've seen the dynamics there. I think both the urban core and the suburbs are going to do very well, and I expect these dynamics to unfold in the next 12 months. Next up, Seattle versus Bellevue. It's always been an argument between the two cities. I said it may seem easy to count Seattle out. I wouldn't do it. I think the best thing to happen to our region is Long Island City telling Amazon that they didn't want them there. Amazon can be a polarizing employer, but from an economic driver for the region, the fact that they're invested in Bellevue, they've spoken for just under 6 million square feet. I expect they'll be up over 7 million square feet by the end of this decade. We've got 10 million square feet going up in Bellevue at some point this decade. I think it's just strengthening the region. I don't think it's Seattle or Bellevue. I think it's Seattle and Bellevue. And I think we're going to see that unfold. Next, as far as sellers, I do think interest rates are going to go up, maybe not as fast based on global destabilization right now, but we've got very low cap rates, a lot of investor demand. I think we're going to have a strong sales cycle the first half of this year. I do expect it to moderate by the end of the year as interest rates start to tick up and we figure out how we're going to repay some of our foreign debt. Next up, new normal. Not yet. I don't think we've completely stabilized. I think we're going to see some oscillations in the next 12 months. So I think it's really important to watch what's happening in the market. I don't think we're on a long-term trend. Back in 2013 and 14, you saw the market take off steadily every single year for 4 or 5 years. I think it's going to take another 12 to 18 months to see some stability in the apartment market. You know, we're recycling some of this legislation. We're getting rid of some of it's sticking around with this 180-day notice requirement in Seattle. So I expect it's going to take a bit of time for that to unravel. Then I think we're going to have a lot of certainty once we get into 2023. Looking next, the long-term focus first up, as far as key takeaways, I think we're back as a region. I think I saw a lot of investors. I would send out emails and I got nasty grams coming from all over the US. I don't like Washington. I don't like Seattle. Don't send me opportunities anymore. They're back. Not all of them, but they believe in the long-term dynamics of the region. And I do think that we're going to see a huge amount of investment in this region. I love this region. I think it's going to do very well for decades and beyond. I think we've got a bull run for the next 20 years. Next up is urban dead. I spoke of that a little bit. I think more long-term, I think we're going to be shocked by 2024 that we ever thought people weren't going to return back to work. I know that seems like a little bit of heresy right now with Zoom and how people are working remotely and they have these wonderful lifestyles. That's just not the way capitalism is built. I look back thousands of years, people always collected at the river bend, whether it was in Mesopotamia, no matter what it was, people want to be near the water where they can exchange ideas, and those are in urban areas. So I think we're going to see that as a long-term trend. We're going to revert back to urbanization. We're going to do it hopefully a little more smartly, a little more intelligently. Next up, the new suburban. We always wondered where the millennials would go. We saw where they went when COVID hit, and they're probably, many of them are going to stick around there. I really like what I call urban suburban. So in our region, it's markets like Woodinville, Issaquah, Edmonds, even Kenmore, Buren. These are downtown centers that are getting revitalized. We're seeing that at Kent Station right now, downtown Tacoma. I think this new normal is we're going to have a new type of suburban where it's not just vast swaths of homes, but there's going to be urban nodes in otherwise suburban areas. We've seen the millennials prefer those areas like Redmond and Woodinville during this last market cycle with COVID. I think that's the new suburban normal, and I'm really bullish on those otherwise suburban markets that are urbanizing. Next up, just an overall new normal. Are we there? Yes and no. The politics are getting better, but if you look at the politics in New York, San Francisco, LA, I just think we've lived in a world a little bit insular in the Northwest, where we had very balanced politics from sort of being a little bit more landlord friendly. I don't think that's going to revert back to where we were pre-COVID. I think we're going to have to align as an industry and protect owners of real estate and really focus with organizations like RHAWA, WUMFA, all these organizations working together, because we're going to have to fight these political headwinds. But I think they're going to get a little bit better. But I think the social issues are here to stay. So I think some people don't have the stomach to be in the urban markets. I think they're going to continue to outperform. But I think we have to understand this is a new normal of social challenges, just the way the world is structured right now. And we have to be prepared as owners of real estate to work together to solve these. But I don't think they're going to go away as we're getting out of the implications of COVID. I think that's just a long-term trend of how we're going to work on this. So I've gone over in my time by just about 5 minutes. I really appreciate everyone's attention. Happy to stick around and answer questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dylan. I think now is a great time for a break. So let's take it. And I'm seeing here back at 10:45, but why don't we make it 10:50 so we have a decent 5-minute break here. And we'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks very much. All right, I think we're nearly back from our break here. And thanks again to Dylan for a great presentation. So next up is Austin Bolin. He'll be going over some tax law trends, of which there are many. So welcome, Austin.
Excellent, Candace. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to all the other speakers who joined today to provide some very helpful content for Washington rental housing owners. My name is Austin Bolin. I'm a partner at Real Estate Transition Solutions. We develop transition plans and exchange strategies for investment property owners who are owning highly appreciated real estate and typically looking to exchange into property that is going to be more passive in nature. So what we call that transition from the third to the fourth quarter of property ownership. The work that we do really layers on financial planning concepts, tax strategy, and then extensive experience within real estate, specifically institutional real estate, given that's commonly a replacement property that we work with. So with that, I'm going to talk through some of the tax trends that have been evolving over the last, call it 2 to 3 years. There's been plenty of conversation both at the local level and then the federal level as to what sort of changes have been.
At Impact Northwest, our mission is to prevent homelessness. We chose Heritage Bank, frankly, because of our relationship with our banker.
Sorry about that pop-up advertisement on a website I was on right there. So a number of changes have been proposed at the local level as well as the federal level that we're going to go through, starting on the local level, and then we'll work our way through some of the federal proposals, talk about the status of those changes, how that may impact you as a property owner. So with that, starting with the local basis, property taxes are one of the taxes that obviously have a very meaningful impact for anyone who owns real estate, whether that's residential for primary residence purposes or investment property, looking all the way through single family through multifamily properties. Often property owners in Washington feel that we pay a disproportionate amount of property tax compared to other states. And the reality is we're actually right in the middle of the pack federally when we look at the United States as a whole. I believe we rank 22nd in the country in terms of our tax rates. 0.93% of assessed value is the state level tax, and then various counties and municipalities can apply their own local tax as well. But what happens is that because our values are also significantly higher than the median property values across the country, about 50% higher on average across Washington state, When we look at real dollars paid in property tax, we rank closer to 13th in the country at that point. So looking forward then, coming into 2022 and then years ahead, many of you have likely already received your property tax assessments and know what your 2022 tax bill will be, with first payment coming up shortly. We very much expect the property taxes that will be due to be higher than that was seen in 2021. And we expect that trend to continue moving forward. There's a couple of reasons why that's the case. The first is going to be the increase in the assessed values. Most properties stayed relatively flat. This isn't across the board the case, but most stayed relatively flat between 2020 and 2021 from an assessed value standpoint, and then saw substantial increases between 2021 and 2022. The actual rates applied did not change at the state or county level, but what did happen is Washington loves to pass special levies on property taxes. Largely, that is to fund local school districts. And there were, I believe, 16 different school district levies in the Puget Sound that were proposed in February election or February. And then so out of that, I think it was 14 of the 16 ended up passing, all but Lake Washington School District. So that will add additional taxes for those that own property that are located within those respective school districts. So long and the short of it being, expect increases in property taxes. The other local tax that's going to be applicable at both the state and county level is going to be excise tax. So Candace, if you would mind jumping to the next slide there. Dylan mentioned this on an earlier slide of his, in which he talked about the surge in property sales that was occurring in advance of the change in the Washington state excise tax, also referred to as the REET tax, so real estate excise tax. And Washington, as at the state level, moved from having a flat tax applied against the gross sales price of a property to a graduated structure. And this will lead to a significant amount of revenue for the state. Not that we necessarily need that at that point, given we have a massive surplus, the largest in Washington state history, just over $2 billion right now. But they pivoted over to the graduated structure that you see outlined in that table in the middle of this slide. So property taxes or property sales prices under 500,000 are subject to a 1.1% excise tax. Again, that is on gross sales proceeds. And then all the way up to sales in excess of $3 million would be subject to a 3% tax. Those are real dollars, and that's a significant change in the structure. It's also worth noting that you are not able to defer this particular tax when looking at 1031 exchanges, whereas you can defer capital gains, depreciation recapture, and net investment income tax. On top of the state level excise tax, there is going to be a county and then a municipality tax, and pretty much every county and municipality in Washington takes the maximum allowable 50 basis points or 0.5% tax there. Now shifting over to capital gains, this is a topic that's received a significant amount of attention, and rightfully so, because in 2021, the Washington State Legislature largely unilaterally passed a bill that implemented what the legislator refers to as an excise tax, but what most individuals who have an understanding of tax code, including all of the policy centers, would very much classify as an income tax. And specifically, this was applied against capital gains in excess of 250,000. Whenever there's a change like this that's proposed, there's going to be a lot of lobbying efforts that occur to either kill it or expand it or carve out particular industries. And that was no different in this situation. What we ended up seeing is real estate as a whole was actually carved out from being subject to the income tax. So that's a win. It's not necessarily in the best interest of the state as a whole to have this income tax in place, but real estate was carved out, whether looking at the sale of a primary residence, or looking at the sale of investment property. Most recently, though, and this is new as of last week, the Douglas County Superior Court was the first court, was the county court selected to hear the challenge of this particular implementation. And Douglas County Superior Court ruled that this should in fact be considered an income tax, and that is inconsistent with Washington State's Constitution and previous rulings coming out of the state Supreme Court. Bob Ferguson and has noted that they plan to appeal this at the state level and at Seattle City level as well. So inevitably, it's going to be a long, drawn-out legal process. We're going to end up seeing this go to the Washington State Supreme Court. It'll probably take another year or more for it to have any sort of resolution. And Washington has said that they're going to continue to apply the tax in the meantime. So not something that property owners need to worry about from the standpoint of a sale of their property. Theoretically, this would be deferrable if one did a 1031 exchange, although by classifying it as an excise tax, that does raise a question as to whether or not it would be deferrable. But behaviorally, it is very much an income tax. Shifting over to the federal side, throughout 2020 on the campaign trail and then 2021, there was a significant amount of conversation about pending tax code change, and very much an evolving process. It's not uncommon to hear politicians in the campaign trail make certain statements, make certain promises, and then end up either diluting or walking off of some of those promises once they've either been elected or are even approaching the election date. What it started with specifically are the items that you see listed here. So there was chatter of there being an outright elimination of Section 1031 of the tax code. That's the section of the tax code that allows for an individual to defer all of their both state, if applicable, and federal capital gains tax, depreciation recapture tax, and net investment income tax into what's referred to as replacement property, as long as certain steps are adhered to in the 1031 exchange timeline. So there was discussion and a proposal of outright elimination of Section 1031 of the tax code. Now, this is not new. This has surfaced multiple times. 2017 in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that was a point of conversation. It was talked about in the early 2000s. But the reality is Section 1031 has been in the federal tax code for over 100 years at this point, and is quite resilient given the benefit it has to the economy as a whole and increasing the velocity at which real estate is bought and sold. And then there's a major impact on jobs as a result of that. Once it was fairly clear that eliminating 1031 exchanges was not going to be feasible, then they pivoted over to saying, well, maybe we're going to limit 1031 exchanges. That had its moment in which it was discussed, and they put certain caps on it, very consistent with what we see for what are referred to as Section 121 exclusions. That's the exclusion of up to 500,000 of gain that is tax-free for selling your primary residence. So really mirroring that. And then there was a discussion of increasing capital gains rates. There's been ongoing conversation about eliminating the step up in basis and then reducing the federal estate tax exemption amount. So we'll talk through each of those in a little bit of detail, give a couple minutes for each of those proposals, and then mirror that or pair it with some strategies that could be utilized in order to address any of those changes, as well as the likelihood of the change. So first step, we have the cutting of the federal estate exemption amount. This is still very much on the table, although the window is closing, given that we have midterm elections fast approaching in November of this year. And the thought of someone who is in a contested seat taking an aggressive tax stance, especially one that is going to be impacting retirees who have been building their retirement plan around expecting a certain exemption amount. What this exemption is in the federal level, we have an estate tax that's applicable for transitioning assets down to beneficiaries. That state tax is it's hefty. It can be as high as 40%, and the graduated brackets that it moves through are fairly low. So it moves quickly up to 40% estate tax. But in order to really protect lower and middle class Americans, there is this federal exemption amount. And as it stands today, per individual, up to $11.7 million of estate value can be transitioned down to beneficiaries without being subject to estate tax. So as a married couple, you'd be looking at $23.4 million of estate value that can move down to beneficiaries without being subject. There's been conversation about reducing that estate tax exemption amount. This is the most probable change that we would see occur in the next few months, but it really would need to take hold sometime in the next, say, 3 to 4 months if it's going to end up being implemented before the midterms. And there's a very low likelihood that it would be implemented following the midterm elections. The strategy that one could use in order to address this, if you have an estate that's over that either current or reduced exemption amount, is to break ownership up among multiple different properties, break ownership up among multiple different owners. So gifting to children can be effective there, or selling property and exchanging into replacement property that allows for what's referred to as a discount for lack of control or marketability. That's a little bit of a complex concept, but the quick and dirty of it is that if you're a minority owner or if you own a non-controlling interest in a property, that it is not, for estate purposes, as valuable as owning the entire property and having control over it. So you can end up seeing as much as a 30 or 40% reduction from fair market value for calculating estate value. And that can be an effective tool to work with if you are bumping up against either the current limitation or a potential reduced limitation. Next slide. The increase in capital gains, this is one in which, if you were to ask me 3-4 months ago, I would have said there's a very good chance we're going to see federal capital gains move from, say, 20 to 25%. There have been a number of individuals, but most notably Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Christina Samina from Arizona, who have been working extensively on the Build Back Better program and have been vocal critics of increasing taxes in any way, which it's very difficult to implement a multi-trillion-dollar package without increasing taxes accordingly. But they've been resistant to it. That's been a big roadblock for the proposed legislation. And at this point, it's looking like there will not be any significant changes to federal capital gains for the foreseeable future. But that 20% maximum capital gains rate is intentionally lower than ordinary income tax rates in order to incentivize long-term investments. So investments held longer than a year in time, and is very much core to our tax code. Taxes are really intended to incentivize and steer people towards certain behavior and outcomes. So we're not expecting to see that actually increase. 3 months ago, I would have taken the other side of the position there. But should it be increased, your solution there is really quite simple. It's continue to utilize 1031 exchanges if you do decide to sell property, so that you can continue to defer that tax until eventually you either decide to pay it down the road, but in the meantime, you have more dollars working for you in owning investment real estate, or if you own until eventually someone passes away, it could be either spouse or an individual, then you receive a concept of a step up in basis, and that capital gains that's been deferred over potentially years or decades is then eliminated at that point. Now, limitations, capping 1031 exchanges, this is not something that we expect to occur. Conversations really quieted down for about the last 5 or 6 months on having there be any sort of impact to 1031 exchanges and proposed tax legislation. This is a credit in large part to the real estate industry as a whole, and everyone from national realtors to NAIOP to Multifamily Housing Council, all of the organizations band together to form what they call the Real Estate Roundtable and are very, very active in speaking with legislators, speaking with their policy aides, letting them know what the impacts of these changes would be, and reminding them of just how large of a role real estate plays in our economy. Some statistics say it's as high as 15% of GDP is related to real estate in some capacity. It's often easy to look at real estate and say, oh, there's just developers and large owners that are cashing large checks and making significant sums of money. But it also is the laborers who are working in the construction industry. It could be the desk jobs that are working at a title and escrow company, the appraisers, the loan originators, et cetera. So we don't expect anything to occur here as it relates to 1031 exchanges. If there were to be a reduction in the maximum allowable gain that could be deferred, again, you could be looking at splitting ownership among multiple individuals. Say you have 2 or 3 children, you own a rental property today, and if you were to sell it, you would be over that proposed $500,000 or $1 million maximum deferrable gain. Well, you could gift ownership to a child, bring them into an LLC, and then break that LLC into a tenant in common and allow each owner to do their own exchange. You could exchange into the same property together, but that way, by having each owner with its own exchange, you're falling underneath that exemption amount and can continue to defer all of that tax. The Delaware statutory trust that I mentioned earlier, that's another form of flexible ownership that allows you to take a single property sale. You can exchange that into fractional ownership of multiple institutional properties, so that then eventually when those properties sell and you're faced with another 1031 exchange decision to continue to defer your tax, you have smaller sales, smaller amount of gain attributed to each sale, and then would then fall under that exemption amount as well. And then lastly, the least likely is going to be the outright elimination of 1031 exchanges. If this were to occur, and it's worth having this knowledge in the back of your mind, if it is proposed and catches momentum 8 years down the road, 15 years down the road, whenever that may be, there's really 2 ways in which you can address this. One of which is, if you still want tax deferral, there is a concept that's referred to as a 721 UPREIT. That's where a larger entity, typically a real estate investment trust, absorbs your property, and you receive ownership in that larger portfolio as your consideration instead of receiving cash proceeds. That's a tax deferral strategy that has had no conversation around modifying in any capacity because there's no economic benefit in the eyes of the IRS. Money is not really changing hands. You're just now contributing a property and receiving shares instead. That's an available option. Problem with that is that most REITs do not want the properties in which many of us own today, given that they're typically acquiring institutional properties, although they do acquire single family now. But if that is something in which you're interested in, you can also do a 1031 exchange into an institutional DST with the intent of that property then being absorbed by a REIT. The other option, in which I believe I mentioned on the next slide here, if there were to be outright elimination, is going to be to structure an installment sale. While this does not provide permanent tax deferral, if you are to take a note on a property and have payments over the course of, let's say, 5-10 years from the buyer, you can spread the tax consequences associated with that sale out among multiple years, triggering less capital gains, less depreciation recapture in each year, also receiving some level of interest income throughout that period of time. So it can serve to reduce the total amount of taxes paid in a liquidity event, but it does have its own considerations, its own risks, such as, are you going to have to repossess the property at some point? What's going to be the condition of the property? You're bearing some level of interest rate risk as a result of that, but it would allow for there to be a reduction in the tax that would otherwise be due if you were to have a lump sum sale. And with that, I mean, that's the overview there of the federal taxes and changes that have been discussed. We are feeling quite confident in terms of how it all played out. You know, it's a reflection in many regards of kind of the brokenness that happens in DC. If the legislators were not able to get some sort of meaningful tax change through with control of the Senate, House, and executive office, you know, when can they? But for property owners, that inability to move forward really served to benefit many individuals from a tax standpoint. If anyone has questions in particular about any proposed tax changes or strategies to address them, we're always happy to have a conversation with you, speak about the specifics of your own situation, brainstorm various transition strategies, and then replacement property options available to you as well.
Thank you, Austin. I always enjoy hearing your updates, and you're right. There are a lot of options out there, and I know that we have clients that have worked with you and been really happy with the options that you presented to them that were customized. So thank you so much for the presentation, and we're going to move on to another hot topic, the rental housing legislative trends. And I know Chester is recovering some of his sleep from a wild 60-day session. So I'll let you give a recap of all of your successes down there.
Well, Candace, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you guys for joining us today. I am very happy to be here today, just kind of to set the stage for anybody who is not following the circus that we have in Olympia. We are in a short legislative session this year. Means it's a 60-day session, and if it's Wednesday today, which I think it is, although it's been one long day for a while, this session ends tomorrow. So we are in the last of things. We've got budgets out. We've already been through the cutoff for most of the bills. So as of last Friday at 5 p.m., that was the cutoff for bills to come out of the opposite house. What that means is if it was a House bill, it will have had to have previously made it out of the House and now make it out of the Senate by last Friday, and therefore be ready to head to the governor's office for potential signature over the next month or so. And so with that cutoff coming last Friday, we are actually in a really, really good position for rental housing. And it's because all of you have been so active in involvement in Olympia and getting those calls to action and sending in messages to lawmakers. We have talked to our lawmakers in Olympia, and they're telling us that they have gotten more messages from small housing providers this year than in any other session. So that is a huge kudos to all of you and all of your hard work. And because of your hard work, now let's talk about the success we've had in Olympia. Can we go ahead and go on? There we go. So and with these bills, you'll all be getting through the Rental Housing Association on Friday our bill tracking report that has all the bills in Olympia that we are following, a summary of each one, the status, and give you a final update on that. But the bills that we wanted to share here are things that have to do with potential economic outlook and forecasts for our folks. And I think it's really important to start this discussion with an understanding of where we are politically as a state. If you guys will remember, just a few years ago, I believe it was 5 years ago now, we had a Senate that was controlled by Republicans in this state by 1 vote. We had a House that was controlled by Democrats by 2 votes, and both sides had to work together if they wanted to get anything done. That was before the election of our previous president, not our current president, but the previous president. That changed everything in the state. And we swung very far to the left after our previous president was elected. In those next 2 election cycles, we saw a lot of things move to the left. I will tell you, because of the change in the president, because of things happening nationally in DC, because of the governor's actions in our state with the eviction moratorium, the mask mandates, the vaccination requirements, there is a head of steam pushing back the other way that we haven't seen in more than 10 years. And so there is a good chance that Olympia might have a little bit more balance when we come back next year. And we'll talk a lot more about elections and things after we're done with session here in the next week. But specifically, what are the bills that could have an impact financially for people out there? The first one of those we want to talk about is House Bill 2020. Now, this bill did not pass. This bill died eventually, but it's one that would require cities under the GMA to have housing plans. It has permitting timelines that get, what am I looking for? sped up for affordable housing. It has requirements of local jurisdictions that they approve things. One of the goals of this bill was to tie the hands of some local government officials when it comes to those decisions, because our city council members do an amazing job, but they get yelled at by everyone all the time. And so it's a really difficult decision for them to look at, whether it's getting rid of single family zoning or allowing duplexes and triplexes in areas that have historically been single family zones. Those are hard decisions for a city council. Those are much easier decisions made at the state level, and then telling the cities what they must do. And therefore, it makes it so that city council member, when they get yelled at by all of these people, they can say, I'm sorry, this was a mandate that came down from the state, we have to do this. And it basically gives them cover to adopt these things. So House Bill 2020 was one that we did a fair amount of work on, and we believe would have actually led to more housing production. This bill didn't pass, but it's one that we do want to be aware of, and one that we'll be continuing to work on in concept, whether that means shortening permitting timelines or expediting processes that include affordable housing, or just the actions that we believe that governments can take in order to get more housing. The good news for us is that they're finally in agreement that we have a housing crisis and that we need to do something and we need to find more housing. Well, the first thing they need to do is stop putting more cost and more regulation on small housing providers and somehow believe that that's going to give them more housing out the other side. When we talk to lawmakers, one of the stories I like to tell them, so they can't relate to what's going on in the housing market. That's the problem. They don't understand it. So we make it something they can understand easier. So if we had a plumbing crisis and there were no plumbers, would you put a lot more cost and regulation on plumbers and think that you were somehow going to get more plumbers by doing that? You know what they say? No, we wouldn't do that. It would give us less plumbers. Well, that's what you're doing with housing. You're putting more cost and regulation on small housing providers and then assuming that it's somehow going to give you more housing, which it never will. So House Bill 2020 was one that actually would have helped us to get more housing across the state, one that we supported, but one that did not make it through. Another bill that was very similar to House Bill 2020, except this was the governor's bill, was House Bill 1782. This is specifically changing single family zoning and creating missing middle housing, whether that involves ADUs or that involves the zoning requirements. The original bill would allow you, anywhere you had a single family house, you could put up to a sixplex. The final bill that did not, again, this bill died as well. We were not able to get this all the way through, even though it was the governor's bill, but it would have said you could put a fourplex anywhere that you have a single family home right now. And the whole goal of this is to increase our housing supply. And Washington, among the top 30 markets, I believe Seattle has less multifamily housing than any other market in the top 30. So kind of an interesting thing, and one of the reasons why we have such a lack of housing in our state is the lack of multifamily housing. All right, so this one I think is very important from an economic standpoint, rent control. Rent control is dead in state of Washington again this year because of your efforts, because of our coalition, because of our president, Sean Flynn, and so many of our government affairs staff. Alex Robertson has done an amazing job, Melissa Canfield, Dee. If you see any of those people from the Rental Housing Association, please give them a huge thank you, because we are the only state on the West Coast that does not have rent control. I'm going to say that again. Washington is the only state on the West Coast without rent control, and we're going to keep it that way. We have had rent control bills for the last 5 years, and we have defeated them each and every year. And we're going to continue to do that because rent control is a terrible idea. If you get 10 economists together, they can't agree on anything, but they can agree that rent control is a bad idea. And when we talk to lawmakers about this, just ask them to point to one city in the country, just one, anywhere in the country where rent control has helped the housing market. It doesn't exist. It misallocates housing. It creates dilapidated and deteriorating housing. It converts residential to commercial and other uses because people don't want to be under rent control. There's a lot of problems with that. And we are very happy and very successful to have been able to kill rent control again this year. So that bill is dead as well. Okay, another great idea they had at the state, which many of you who are in Seattle already have seen this idea. And if you don't know this, the Rental Housing Association has actually filed suit regarding this. But the state of Washington would like to ban your use of criminal records in screening. How would that affect your ability to moderate your risk? How would that affect your prices? How would that affect your financial outlook? If you don't know if you're going to put somebody with a bunch of felonies next to the single mom with 2 kids, And guess what the bill doesn't do? It bans your use of criminal records, but it doesn't make you not liable for the actions that might take place there. So you can still be sued by the single mom with 2 kids if you put somebody next door not having any idea because you couldn't do tenant screening, and that person is a problem. So this is a huge issue for us, and one that the Rental Housing Association actually, just prior to COVID, we brought 200 landlords down to Olympia in buses with blue shirts. And we took every seat in the hearing room when they were trying to do this, to trying to ban criminal records in screening in 1999. And I tell you, it was one of the most successful adventures we've ever had in Olympia. The chair of the committee leaned over to the vice chair and said, "Wow, that is a lot of tenants we have here today." And the chair leaned back and she said, "Those are landlords." And they both just looked at each other. And that bill died that day. Your involvement in Olympia is critical. They care what you think, and they care if you don't like the things they're doing, but they have to hear about it. And that's where all of you come in, and you guys did an amazing job this year helping us to kill the banning of criminal records in tenant screening. Another terrible idea. How about allowing tenants to sue you under the Consumer Protection Act? How about if you make an easy mistake on a notice, they can sue you under the CPA with triple damages and attorney's fees? Then how about they do something intentional and damage your unit, and you can't sue them under the CPA period? That's what this bill does. We killed this bill as well. There was nothing in this bill that we supported and nothing in this bill that we liked. And it is, again, because of all of your hard work and your involvement, your testimony in those hearings, you're sending emails to lawmakers, making those phone calls. Because you did that, we were able to kill this bill too. And if you're getting the message that there's a lot of dead bills, there are. And that's a really good thing for us this year, because there were so many bad bills out there targeting small housing providers. And because of all your efforts and because of our hard work and relationships in Olympia, we were able to defeat nearly all of those bills. So we'll talk about that. Okay, the biggest bill this year from a standpoint of things we didn't support that had a chance of moving was House Bill 1904. This bill had rent control light in it, which would have said that the original bill, if you gave a rent increase over 3.5%, you were required to give between 180 and 220 days of notice. And the original bill allowed the tenant to just walk away from their lease anytime in there with no notice, and required you as the housing provider to prorate their rent back to them for the number of days they didn't use in that month, even though they gave you no notice. It also limited your late fees to 1.5%. So you as the housing provider would become the cheapest bank that they could possibly find. And why would a tenant pay their rent on time when they can use that for the rest of the month and only pay 1.5% for that use of that money? So this is a bill we didn't support across the board. It was brought by the chair of the House Housing Committee. We've had a good relationship and did work on this with them, let them know we could not support this, and we were able to kill this bill as well. It didn't even make it out of the House and over to the Senate. So that's a really big deal for us, and a really big deal for us to be able to accomplish this year in the session that we had. All right, how about some more bad bills that we were able to kill? The governor also last year had a bill called House Bill 1083. It was looking to ban natural gas. This year, the governor had 3 bills trying to ban natural gas. House Bill 1770, banning natural gas through the State Building Code Council. This was the one that was alive the longest. So there was House Bill 1767, which was banning natural gas through electrification. There was House Bill 1766, which was banning natural gas through the gas companies. We killed those bills earlier on, but this one survived and is actually still alive right now. Now, we think that we've got support from Democrats in the Senate to keep this bill from coming up. But the whole goal is to ban natural gas in Washington, which is problematic. So we are a green state. We are the second greenest state in the country. We believe in green initiatives, but this doesn't make sense. We don't have enough power to have power during peak demand periods without natural gas. And in fact, the largest city who has done this already, the city of San Jose, there are no states, by the way, who have banned natural gas. Washington would have been the first. But the city of San Jose and a couple of other California cities have done it. And so San Jose has this wonderful rolling blackouts at peak demands from time to time because they can't turn on their giant natural gas-fired turbine that produces power for them that they've always used because of this law. So we already have a lot of hydro in the state of Washington. It's a very clean form of energy. And if you look, the thing that helped us defeat this bill this year, and I do believe we've defeated it, although it's still alive till tomorrow, was helping lawmakers to understand that Europe just came out with a new green energy program. I believe it was about 5 weeks ago now. And the centerpiece of that is clean burning natural gas. So Europe is defining natural gas as a clean energy source, and our governor is trying to ban it. That's where we live, and that's where we are right now. And I'm sorry to say we're going to need your help one more time on this issue, because we are going to beat this bill at the legislature. It's going to die. But then the State Building Code Council is going to try to do this again on Friday. So you'll be getting a call to action from the Rental Housing Association Coalition asking you to write in or participate in that hearing and let them know we do not support removing natural gas as an energy source at all, especially given that we don't have enough power and the governor wants to make everyone go to electric vehicles, which I'm not sure how we power those when we don't have enough electricity now. But this is a big, big, big deal, and something that we're working on with a lot of partners, including we've gotten the trades and the unions involved in this on our side to oppose this as well. All right, another bad idea at the legislature that we were able to kill. This is both for residential and commercial real estate. They wanted to remove the column that says, I don't know, from the seller disclosure, and then make you say yes or no, and then make you financially liable for your answers. So this bill originally would have removed the I don't know column, and you'd have to say yes or no. And if you said the wrong thing, you could be sued for that. That is not something that we support in any way, shape, or form. And the seller disclosure statement is fine the way that it stands. We were able to kill that bill, so it is dead. How about another bad idea? Senate Bill 5278. This would have made the general contractor responsible for the wages of the subcontractor's employees. That's how bad this bill was. And with the BIAW, the AGC, and some others, we were able to kill this bill and make sure it did not pass this year. Okay, last couple of bills. These are really more property rights issues, but we have manufactured housing that's part of our membership as well. They were attempting to increase the park notice to close a manufactured housing community park from 12 months to 3 years. It's already a violation of the separation, or excuse me, the uniformity clause in our Constitution that requires all property be treated equally, because manufactured housing communities are the only kind that has a 12-month notice before they can sell. We've always been okay with that. We have relocation assistance already in that area, so it's something that we can work on. But a 3-year park closure was unrealistic and ridiculous, and would have led to a lot less housing in the state of Washington, because generally the parks that are closing are going from 50 mobile homes to 350 multifamily housing units, and are often in transit-oriented development areas. Last one, and this one's on here both because it's a manufactured housing community issue and because we're seeing it brought to cities across the state on rental housing. And it's a forced right of first refusal. So the bill would have required manufactured housing communities to give notice to the tenants who live there and an opportunity to buy the manufactured housing community park before they could offer it for sale. Even if the tenants didn't have any money, even if they had no resources, they could still hold up a sale for more than 135 days, taking it outside of a 1031 exchange. That's a property rights issue. That is a taking. We do not support that in any way. And we have a case from the state of Washington called MHCW versus the state of Washington on this issue. So why do we care on the rental housing side? Well, one, we do manufactured housing community stuff too here. But two, we've seen cities like the city of Olympia try to say that if you have a single family home and you want to sell it, you have to offer it to your tenant before you can offer it for sale with no qualifications. And I will just say, I don't support that because it's, again, a property rights issue. But more than that, I had a client during COVID who had a tenant who owed them more than $20,000 in rent. And so they had to eventually put the property up for sale because they couldn't continue to float it. About a week into that, we got an offer from the tenant who said that they had more than $25,000 saved that they would like to purchase the property with. The same $25,000 that they hadn't paid in rent over the last 14 months in that case. So, you know, we don't support that. We don't support taking our property rights and giving them to somebody else. This is just a solid no. And we were able to kill this bill again. Okay, that's the very quick version of Olympia, but I'm happy to talk about those bills or anything else. I'm going to mention one more bill because a lot of people care about it. They did ban high capacity magazines, anything over 10 rounds, for both assault rifles and handguns last Friday, right before, well, at the deadline. It was the last bill that the House ran And so it does look like that's going to pass forward. And that's well outside of our sphere, but something that is sort of broadly cared about by people. So I thought I might mention it.
Thank you, Chester. That was an energetic and fast review of a wild session. Only 60 days to get all of that done. Amazing. And I have to say, I'm just so impressed with the outcomes this time, right? We have had such a long run of kind of bad news on the state, the county, and the city level. So it's nice to see a little bit of that changing. I'm happy now to kind of transition to a Q&A session. And I'll kind of kick it off a little bit with you, Chester, if that's okay, since we're all revved up on legislative issues right now. So and you've answered a lot of questions in terms of, point by point, what's going on with each of the bills that you killed, or that succeeded. One of the questions that came through earlier was around whether you see additional tenant protections. And I'll kind of expand that question. That was one that came from the audience. But what maybe are the best bills, right? The ones that you really want the rental housing community to rally around and to support in Olympia, right? Because we don't always want to be not having anything that we support, right? And then on the flip side, what are sort of the worst ones that we really need to focus on galvanizing against?
Yeah, great question, Candace. So this legislative session, I believe that we were very successful for a number of reasons, one of which is the involvement of all of our members, so all the grassroots that we've had. Another one is the political wins. If you look at the city of Seattle in the races, the mayor's race last year, the city attorney race with Ann Davison and Sarah Nelson's race, it was sort of a bellwether for the state to look at whether we were going to go farther to the left or whether we were going to come back to some bit of balance. And, not only did we win one of those races in Seattle or two, we won all three, which was surprising a little bit to me and to other people because we've seen such a hard time trying to bring some balance back to things, especially around Seattle. But when you see that kind of balance coming back in places like Seattle, you can imagine that the rest of the state is way out in front and feeling similarly. And so we're seeing pretty big trends pushing back towards some balance. And as an association, I just want to remind everybody, we are bipartisan. Republican, Democrat, we support both of those. If you understand housing providers, real estate, and what we go through as small housing providers, you're our friend and we support you. But there is, we do have both a Senate and a House controlled by Democrats. And there is a chance that with this next election, we might bring some balance back to Olympia and maybe have some divided government. And, when we had divided government, everyone benefited because both sides had to work together. And I think there's a good chance we get back to some form of that next year. And so that really changes what we're what we can be successful at doing in Olympia. So when we have a democratically controlled House, Senate, and governor's office, we're playing defense. And that is by far the most important thing that we do for our members, is to keep bad things from happening to them. And that's wonderful. We love doing that. That is the bulk of my job. But I will tell you, it's much more fun to pass bills that we're actually excited about. And so, we've been looking at an electronic notices bill that would make it so that you could give those notices electronically via email, still sending by regular mail to the tenant, if the tenant were to elect in their rental agreement or some other agreement. We think that's a really good bill, both to save a little bit of money, and it's a win-win. The tenant doesn't have a notice posted on their door that makes them embarrassed to be in their housing complex, and the landlord doesn't have to send a process server out, and we get to save a little bit of money on it. So we are looking to bring the Residential Landlord Tenant Act into at least the 20th century, if not the 21st century. And the bill that passed last year, if we were to have the ability to run offensive legislation, not only would we be looking for things that are for the better of the industry, like electronic notices, we'd be looking to push back on some of the things that have happened, like the Just Cause bill, or forced lease renewal, as I prefer to call it. It should have an exclusion for fixed term leases because that's the way the law has been forever. The legislature refused to put that in, but if we get balance back, that's one of the first things we will be running, is bringing back the ability to have a fixed term lease, and that being outside of Just Cause completely, where it should be. In addition to those, there are a lot of areas where we as housing providers have taken lumps over the last 5 years, and places that we need to bring back some balance. The Residential Landlord Tenant Act has for the past 50 years been a balanced act, somewhere where we balance the rights and duties of tenants with the rights and duties of landlords, and nobody gets more than their share and everybody works together. That has been unbalanced in the last 5 years. And so when we get a little bit more, again, balance in Olympia, we're going to look to right those scales a little bit to make sure that we actually have a law that works for both sides and will be successful at bringing back housing, because we have, at the end of the day, we have a massive housing crisis in this state. And the more things they do to force small housing providers to decide to leave the market, the less naturally affordable housing they have, because there's no such thing as affordable housing in Washington anymore. It is just expensive housing that we choose to subsidize.
Thanks, Chester. Do you cover City of Seattle, or is this a question? There's a question about lawsuits that RHA is bringing in the courts for City of Seattle. And I'm not sure if that's something that we can answer offline, or maybe that information can be found in the Advocacy Center.
Yeah, why don't I follow back up with that person? But
Okay.
that is to say, RHA has several lawsuits against the City of Seattle and is litigating against these things
Okay.
on some of the actions that were taken by the city with the moratorium, on the criminal records ban. I know that we have a pending lawsuit, and I know that there's actually a couple of others. I wish William Shadbolt was with us today, because he's sort of our legal defense guru, but we're out there fighting for these things.
Yeah, and that is a good plug for the Advocacy Center. I've really found that that's been an amazing way for RHA members to plug in and, answer to call to actions and be updated on what bills are going, whether it's a fast session in Olympia or if it's something local to your jurisdiction, to stay up to speed on. So thanks for that. I'm going to try and address both questions that are coming in from the audience, and please do submit questions and I'll try to field those with our different speakers here. I also have a list that's kind of come in over the course of this presentation as well. So we have plenty to talk about. We'll try and keep it under the top of the hour. So let's see, for Mr. Bolin, please talk about the difference between marginal and effective tax rates.
Good question. So marginal tax rates are any sort of rates that's going to be in a graduated structure. So you previously had a flat tax applied to the Washington State real estate excise tax. That was the 1.28% that was applied at the state level, paired with then the option for 0.5% at the municipal level, or county and municipal level. Now that's pivoted over to having marginal graduated structure, where based off of the sales price of the property, that's going to dictate what tier of tax you're in. And it's not as a calculation whereby, say you sell a $3.5 million property that would put it into that highest bracket of 3%. Not all 3.5 is going to be subject to that 3%. The first 550,000 is going to be subject to the 1.1%, and then the next tier is going to be subject to the second rate, and so on and so forth. It frankly makes for a far more complicated calculation, and not something that you can just often say, oh, you're selling a property for this, here's your excise tax. You need an Excel spreadsheet for that. There is one available on the Department of Revenue website that you can download, and you can just plug in the sales price and it'll kick out what the state tax is. Now, the municipal piece, the county and then local jurisdiction piece, that is still typically structured in a flat way. I don't know of any municipalities that have it graduated. So there, if it is, say, 0.5%, then it would be applied on all of the sales proceeds moving through. The effective rate technically is going to be, if you look at the tax that was calculated going through those marginal brackets and apply that to the total sales proceeds, that's going to get you really what would be referred to as a blended tax rate. That's what the effective rate is there. So, that's something that isn't as relevant for excise tax purposes, because there's less kind of planning and strategy that can be done around that. But when you're looking at scenarios like partial 1031 exchanges and you have some taxable boot resulting from it, and how is that tax treated, now the blended and effective rate is a very much relevant conversation point.
Thanks, Austin. I've got a question that we discussed as we were kind of pre-meeting, that everyone says, Well, housing is, housing as an investment is considered a hedge on inflation. And everyone sort of knows that, but let's discuss why is that? And James, could you maybe kick that off and then anyone else can hop in?
Yeah, so we talked about how wages tend to rise in tandem with inflationary pressures, which means that, and there's a connection between wages and the value of property. Of course, we have to keep in mind that the fund rate mixes into that, right? So if the fund rate rises really quickly, inflation rises at the same time, then the math doesn't hold up for this argument. But in general, that doesn't happen. The rate structure tends to stay fairly stagnant. So the value of real estate appreciates at a just as fast or faster rate than you're going to see the other way. So you see real growth from that perspective.
All right, great. Anyone else want to chime in?
Specifically
So-
on inflation,
Say that again.
inflation specifically.
Well, and that was, yeah, as a hedge on inflation. I mean, we always sort of say that, but when we break it down, there were some questions as to kind of why that is. So feel free to weigh in on a little bit more there.
I think one of the arguments behind why real estate in particular is a better inflation hedge than other asset classes. So talking about equities, so stocks or bonds or anything else there. And there are others, gold is and other commodities are also viewed as inflation hedges, is because when you look at real estate, one of the primary ways to value real estate is going to be off of replacement cost. And if replacement cost is increasing because building a new home or competitive housing is going to be built at a higher materials cost, higher labor cost, then inevitably they're going to end up needing to have higher rents in order to have a return on that investment or deliver a return to the investors that were supporting that particular project. That impacts all real estate, whether we're talking about multifamily or commercial office or industrial. But then when you look more specifically at property types and those that fall under short duration lease properties, what we would consider then to include multifamily, hospitality properties, and then self-storage properties, there you also have the ability to adjust your rents on an ongoing basis and actually capture what James was referring to, which is that wage growth component. Whereas if you own a CVS and it has a 20-year lease on it, you're beholden to that lease that has defined rent escalators that may average out at 1.5% a year or so. That 1.5% a year didn't feel like a bad rent escalator when we had our historic 10-year inflation at 1.8%, I believe, somewhere right in there. But when we have 4 or 4.5 or 5% inflation, now you're falling behind pretty quickly in terms of what would be market rent. So with multifamily, you can adjust on an ever ongoing basis and capture that. So it gives in many regards kind of a double tailwind of the value of that property. Is the real value going up or is it just inflationary growth? I think that's a question for the economists, but that's our take on why multifamily specifically serves to hedge against it.
Austin brings up a really interesting point, Candace. It depends, right? It depends on the type of property, the location of the property. There's all the underlying things. Does real estate better than an equity investment? Well, it depends on what you put the equity in. It all just depends. So there is no hard and fast. But if I can, I don't know who it was. Someone mentioned the term affordable housing, and I can't let the term go by without saying it's not a real thing. Housing has never been affordable for everyone. We don't have a concrete definition of what housing means, and we don't have a definition of what affordable is. So the term itself is a manufactured term. And so we always, anytime we get into a conversation that people want to talk about affordable housing, we come back to this is a policy question. It's not an economics question. It's not a real estate question. It's not even I'm a landlord question. It's a policy question around defining what affordable housing is. And then that leads to questions around, well, is it a policy response or is it how do you get there? But you will never make some form of housing affordable for everyone. So it just mathematically doesn't work. So it's a bigger, much bigger conversation.
Great. Well, I've got another question that relates to, it's sort of a two-part, and I think Dylan and Jamie might want to weigh in on this. One is if there's someone in the audience that's considering selling their property, what would be some things that they would want to consider, do as it relates maybe to rents or exteriors, something along those lines. And Dylan and Jamie, you can answer those. And then on the flip side, on the buy side, what are some things to look for?
I can jump in and say that prepping your property appropriately is just good behavior it's going to make it easier for the person buying it. It's going to make it easier for you as the seller. So like we always look at, the foundational stuff. If there's a roof that's falling in, take care of it. But then also like the superficial stuff, which we view as paint, appliances, fencing, yard work, countertops, things where you're not cracking into a wall where you might trip into a very, very big expense. But you do want to, I think there was a common trend in 2021 of people thinking that you could just dump a, horrible property on the market and there's so much demand that somebody's going to grab it, and it's just not true. And I think as the rates hike up, it's going to be less and less true. Dylan, do you have thoughts? I mean, that's more on the single family space.
Candace, that cut out a little bit. Can you just give me the question?
Let me ask the question again. So the question was, if you have in this audience, there may be people that are considering selling their property, and what would be recommendations that you would have? It would be a slightly nuanced question. We talked a little bit about kind of making it show ready on the single family home side. I know that on the investment side, it has a lot to do with income. And so what are some recommendations that you make to sellers if they're considering selling their property to kind of ready it for the market?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. I'll give you one of my favorite lawyer responses. It depends. What we often see is people want to over improve a property that they may not get paid a return on. So I really think it depends on your circumstance. I highly recommend taking care of maintenance items. So if there's a leaky roof, if there's stuff that really is impacting the structure of the house or of the building or impacting the operations. But if it's an older property and you think the next buyer may be wanting to improve it, to go put a fresh coat of paint or reseal the driveway or fix a couple of countertops and put in some new appliances may not be the best use of money because it may not increase value. So for me, I think the best answer is always, that's very similar to what you just heard, is keep up with maintenance items, especially things that can impact the structure of the building. And work with a qualified broker to go out, and we always do a walkthrough and make recommendations. And oftentimes we have owners that want to over improve their property that we don't think they're going to get paid a return on. In other cases, we may have some recommendations to spruce some things up so it doesn't look like there's too much deferred maintenance. So it does depend, but big picture, I think I'll get some nods from Candace. Working with a really qualified broker that understands the property, understands the market, to give some recommendations is the best way to proceed. That way, the money that you're spending, if you do make improvements, you're actually seeing some return on.
Yeah, great comment. And then on the flip side, for those in the audience that may be interested in investing, what would be some recommendations that you would make? And I think Jamie and Dylan are great resources for this question. What are some recommendations that you would make in terms of areas that you're interested in, things that you really look for with a property beyond the three, right? Location, location, location.
Oh, go ahead, Jamie.
Oh, I'll jump in real quick, Dylan. So one, we're pretty bullish on what we refer to as secondary markets. So if you think about a primary market being like a Seattle or a Bellevue, and a tertiary market being like a Cle Elum, we like to live in the secondary market where you can access a primary market for earning power, but you have more amenities in terms of parks and spaces, and it's just a little more space. House sizes are bigger, lot sizes are bigger, all that stuff. So we always focus on that. We traditionally focus on properties that are predictable in their maintenance schedule. So properties, Havium doesn't invest in properties that were built more than 15 years ago. That's just because I was a banker for 10 years and I'm terrified of risk. But I also, and this kind of calls back to one of the questions that came during my presentation, was kind of along the lines of timing the market. I just want to kind of highlight trying to time the market, just like in the stock market. It's not a good, you're going to lose as much as you're going to win, if not more. And so what we always tell people is, if you're staying in, particularly if you're staying in real estate as an investment, look to what opportunities are available against the opportunity you have in hand. And if you can improve your circumstances through a 1031 exchange or some other avenue, do it, but pay less attention to trying to, time the market for when it's a good time to sell and a good time to buy, because you will inevitably end up losing more often than not. So we say, just pay attention. You can talk to myself if you're looking at a specific single family type. It sounds like Austin is a good resource, or Candace or Dylan, when it comes to trying to figure out how efficient your property or your investment is. But I just want to caution people against investing for a short period and timing the market, because neither of those things work out all that well in the long run.
My thought on it really just depends on who you are as an individual. I think it's a very individualized question. I have some clients that just are scared to death of Seattle because of all the legislation and all the rules. And I point to, all of this occurred in San Francisco in the 80s. And if we all would have put money in real estate in the Bay Area in the 1980s, we'd all be retired discussing this on an island. And their legislation's been there for decades. They've had rent control. So, one of the factors I look at, I've seen a great correlation from income growth to property value growth. So that's sort of a metric that I look at. And when you see incomes grow, you often see the economics of the property grow. So in the heart of COVID, I felt really strongly about investing in the University of Washington, West Seattle, Capitol Hill, because those are markets that investors were running out of. But I had belief, back to Jamie's point, in the long-term fundamentals of these markets. So there are contrarian people out there that are okay with the contrarian plays. We've also expanded our brokerage business to Eastern Washington. I'm seeing terrific opportunities in Tri-Cities, in Spokane, in Wenatchee, and some of these other secondary and tertiary markets. So I think the real level set is, look yourself in a mirror and what kind of investor are you? And also the other part is, what kind of risk do you want to take on? Are you the person who's going to go out to the property and do improvements? Or do you have to hire a third-party manager and outside vendors that could be very expensive and margins are pretty thin? And if you're fairly handy, then maybe get into something where you can create some upside for yourself, where you're doing the work yourself. Or if you want something that's more turnkey, maybe you could focus on something that all the work is already done. The returns are a little bit more, predictable, but they're not as high. So I think really defining what your investment thesis is and what your level of involvement is the starting point before you even look at properties or locations, to understand, are you a Coke or Pepsi person, or are you Tesla's going to the moon and you want to take the risk? It's not too much different from the stock market. If you want a treasury bill, just go buy in Bellevue, and it's going to be a treasury bill return right now, and it's never going to go anywhere, but it's probably not going to have the highest returns. If you're a bit more speculative and contrarian, jump into West Seattle before the bridge opens, jump into South Lake Union, jump into some of these markets that have taken a hit if you believe in reurbanization.
Well, and that's such a good, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add one point to what Dylan was saying, which is, for the people that we run into that really want to roll up their sleeves and take ownership over maintenance items, it gets old pretty quickly. There's definitely people that love doing it. For me, it just wasn't in my wheelhouse. And right now, we are incredibly cautious about taking on any projects that require labor or materials, because it can take a project that you would think you could do in 2 weeks out 4 or 6 months, depending on what you're looking at. I mean, speaking to James's story about ordering his oven, try renting a unit without an oven for 6 months or a year.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Well,
One item that I'd layer on top of that topic of defining your thesis and your objectives is also be comfortable with those objectives changing as you go through the chapters of life. Because the risk tolerance that you may have, at Jamie and my age, and the willingness to dig into a property is going to be different at 60 years old, and it better be different by 80 years old. And so making sure that you understand that that's a dynamic space of what your objectives are. You start to see as owners age, an increasing focus and emphasis on estate planning. How are you going to transition ownership to beneficiaries, maybe without forcing a co-ownership arrangement, or addressing Washington estate tax or federal estate tax, and having that be a dynamic, evolving, ongoing process is very important, and making decisions in line with that. So kind of viewing life as chapters.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, it's interesting because we, as a group of investors, you think that we always have an investor mindset and always looking to add value. And it really just depends on the type of owner, the life cycle, like you said, what their risk tolerance is. And so the recommendations can be so different. And I'm sure Dylan and Jamie and myself, I mean, on the sort of the brokerage side, you really see a lot of different objectives and a lot of different perspectives when it comes to real estate. And the other piece that I think we're seeing is, what's your investment timeline for a given property, right? We saw some huge swings and shifts in markets in a very short amount of time. And, some of the markets that no one would even consider touching, like a Capitol Hill with all of the unrest, now, is vibrant again, and restaurants are open and people are moving there. And so, and that was in the span of just a year. And most of the time, these investment properties are, between 5 and 10 years as an ownership cycle. So really, when you think about forecasting and some of the comments that Dylan made looking forward, are we going to be in this kind of, downtown sort of a mess, and the council's a mess and all of this? Is that really what we're going to see in 5 years? Because you're buying right now. And so making a bet on that sort of that future option. So
I wrote a piece years ago that Burien is the next Ballard, and I took a lot of heat, but I'm sticking to my guns on that one, and I think people are going to see it, but that takes a lot of vision to go that far out.
I like it. Well, I'm getting the high sign and the hook. So it's been a great conversation. Here is a way to keep the conversation going. So thanks to all of our speakers, Chester and Austin and James and Jamie and Dylan. Awesome job, and look forward to trying to do it again sometime. And here's some resources from RHA to keep that conversation going. Thank you.